Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of the wizarding mind from the world of Harry Potter. One of the most mysterious magical beings is the boggart, a creature that transforms into the worst nightmare of whoever looks at it. But it's more than just a scare. Like a mirror, it reflects a person's deepest fears, traumas, and hidden weaknesses. In J.K. Rowling's books, the topic of boggarts is only partially explored. So today I want to revisit the fears that boggarts revealed for the main characters, and also reflect on what terrors might have haunted those who never encountered one in the story. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Harry Potter, a Dementor. Harry first encountered a boggart during Professor Lupin's Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Many expected it to turn into Voldemort, his archenemy, but instead it became a Dementor. Why? Because Harry didn't fear a specific enemy, he feared the paralyzing terror and hopelessness that Dementors brought. During a later conversation with Lupin, it became clear Harry wasn't afraid of death or pain. He feared fear itself. He feared losing himself in the dark, becoming powerless, consumed by nightmares. And that made his fear far deeper and more complex than most. Number 2. Hermione Granger, failing exams, Professor McGonagall. Hermione's boggart appears humorous at first, Professor McGonagall coldly telling her she's failed all her exams. But there's much more behind this than simple academic anxiety. As a Muggle-born witch, Hermione always felt she had to prove she truly belonged in the magical world. Failure in school for her felt like being cast out. And hearing that from McGonagall, a symbol of authority and respect, was a true horror. Number 3. Ron Weasley, a giant spider. If you've seen The Chamber of Secrets, you already know Ron hates spiders. So when the boggart turned into a giant one, no one was surprised. But the roots of this fear go back to childhood. When Ron was just 3, his brother Fred turned his teddy bear into a spider as a prank. Since then, spiders have become the face of terror for him. While Ron's fear is simple and even typical, it's no less real. Still, Ron followed Harry into the forest full of spiders, proving once again he's a true Gryffindor. Number 4. Neville Longbottom, Professor Snape in Grand's clothes. One of the most comical yet touching moments was Neville's boggart, which turned into Professor Snape. To defeat it, Neville imagined Snape in his grandmother's clothes, complete with a hat and handbag. Funny, yes, but also tragic. Snape had bullied Neville for years, crushing his confidence. Some fans even speculate that Snape resented Neville because of the prophecy, that if Voldemort had chosen Neville instead of Harry, everything might have turned out differently. Number 5. Remus Lupin, the full moon. In that same class, Lupin quickly stepped between Harry and the boggart. It transformed into a full moon, a subtle hint at the professor's hidden secret. He was a werewolf. Lupin had feared hurting others since childhood. He was ashamed of his condition, haunted by isolation and discrimination. The boggart's form wasn't just a moon, it was the embodiment of guilt, pain, and the ever-present fear of being rejected. Number 6. Albus Dumbledore, Ariana's dead body. While we never see Dumbledore face a boggart in the books, J.K. Rowling later revealed that his would be the corpse of his sister, Ariana. He blamed himself for her death. She was killed during a duel between Dumbledore, his brother Aberforth, and Gellert Grindelwald. That guilt became the central tragedy of his life. It even led him to a fatal mistake, putting on Marvolo Gaunt's cursed ring, hoping to use the resurrection stone to see Ariana again. That ring poisoned him, marking the beginning of the end for the great wizard. Number 7. Lord Voldemort, his own dead body. Voldemort never encounters a boggart in the books, but Rowling confirmed his worst fear, death. His boggart would be his own lifeless body, defeated, cold and still. This isn't surprising, considering his obsession with immortality. Horcruxes, dark magic, everything he did was aimed at escaping death. His dead form is his personal apocalypse, the thing he spent a lifetime running from. Number 8. Draco Malfoy, Public humiliation. If Draco Malfoy ever faced a boggart, it might step forward wearing his own face, clothes torn, face flushed, surrounded by laughter. Not just anyone's laughter, Potter's, Granger's, Weasley's, the trio he tried so hard to look down upon, but in that moment their eyes would be on him with pity and mockery, and he would be powerless. For a boy raised to value legacy and pride above all else, public shame wasn't just painful, it was ruin. In Half-Blood Prince, Draco vanishes from the swaggering boy he once was. When he tells Dumbledore, "I have to do this, he'll kill me," there's no arrogance, just fear. He's no longer protected by his father's name, no longer admired, just a boy crumbling under the weight of expectations. His boggart wouldn't threaten his life, it would destroy his image, because in his world, disgrace is worse than danger. And laughter, when it's aimed at a Malfoy, is louder than any curse. Number 9. Sirius Black, Azkaban and Dementors. When Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, he left behind more than prison walls. He left behind screams no one else could hear. The Dementors didn't just drain warmth, they hollowed memory. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, he tells Harry, "I can still hear them. My mother screaming, Bellatrix laughing, James dying." A boggart would take that form. The iron bars, the suffocating dark, Dementors circling like vultures, but worst of all, his own reflection, pale and lifeless, trapped behind the cell door. A man who once laughed, now silent, forgotten, erased. Sirius didn't fear death, he feared being caged, stripped of his voice, branded a traitor. He watched the world move on while he sat alone with ghosts. When he risked everything to reach Harry in Order of the Phoenix, it wasn't just rebellion, it was redemption. He couldn't let injustice win again. His boggart wasn't just prison, it was powerlessness. It was watching truth vanish into silence and knowing no one believed you were ever worth saving. Number 10. Ginny Weasley, Tom Riddle with the diary. If Ginny Weasley ever faced a boggart, it would likely step forward as Tom Riddle, young, handsome, and hollow-eyed, holding the cursed diary that once nearly destroyed her. His smirk would be cold. The room around her would dim. For Ginny, this wasn't just a fear of Voldemort, it was a fear of herself, of the girl who wrote secrets into those pages. In Chamber of Secrets, she whispers to Harry, "I didn't know, I found it, and I thought it was just a diary." But it wasn't. It was a door she opened, and monsters came through. She wasn't just possessed, she was used. And even though it wasn't her fault, the guilt lingered. The memory of blacking out, of waking up near petrified students, haunted her. That boggart wasn't about death, it was about losing control, about being forced to hurt people she loved, about knowing that something evil had once lived inside her and fearing it could come back. Tom Riddle's face would be a reminder. That evil doesn't always knock. It whispers, smiles, and asks for secrets. Number 12. Bellatrix Lestrange. Powerlessness and captivity. If a boggart had risen in front of Bellatrix Lestrange, it would not have turned into Dumbledore or Harry Potter. It would have become herself, chained, silenced, wandless, her eyes dull, her voice gone. She wouldn't be screaming spells, she would be weeping, powerless. That was her fear, not death, but uselessness. She had endured Azkaban and returned more vicious than ever, but the terror that lived under her madness was the idea that she could be broken, not by an enemy, but by failure. That she might kneel before Voldemort and hear him say, "You are no longer of use to me." Bellatrix fought like someone who had nothing to lose. In Order of the Phoenix, she laughed as Sirius fell through the veil. She had just killed her own cousin, and she smiled. But when Voldemort appeared in the Ministry and addressed her as "my dear Bellatrix," her entire body bowed, eyes lit with hunger. Her identity was stitched to his approval. Take that away, strip her of magic, mission, and meaning, and all that would be left was a hollow shell. The boggart knew it. It would not humiliate her. It would erase her purpose. Her loyalty to blood purity was never about principle. It was about control. Being pure meant being chosen, being superior. Bellatrix was not born strong. She built her strength through fear and devotion. She screamed her spells as if trying to drown her own doubt. Every battle cry was a desperate reminder. I matter, I serve, I still belong. But the boggart would whisper the opposite, that she was forgotten, powerless, and no one would come to free her, not even him. Number 13, Minerva McGonagall, dead, students under her care. When the battle for Hogwarts began, Professor McGonagall stood tall in front of the castle. Her wand was steady, her voice commanding, but inside she carried a fear that never left her. If a boggart had stepped into the great hall, it might have turned into the lifeless bodies of her students, lying on the cold stone floor, wands beside them, eyes open to nothing. Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, Fred Weasley, each name a knife to the heart. It wouldn't be a scream, just a silence she could never forgive herself for. Minerva McGonagall wasn't just a teacher. She was the guardian of a generation. She taught them spells, corrected their essays, sent them to bed, and fought to protect them when the walls shook with war. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, she casts Pietotum Locomotor and breathes, I've always wanted to use that spell. It's a rare smile, but behind it is pure steel. She doesn't fight because she wants glory. She fights because those children are her pride, her duty, her reason. She lost students. She had to walk past the fallen in the final moments of the war. And though she never let it break her on the outside, her fear was always clear. In Order of the Phoenix, she clashes with Umbridge again and again, not for her own sake, but for her students. You have no authority here, she tells her coldly. It wasn't just anger, it was a promise, not on my watch. But in her darkest thoughts she feared that promise might be broken, that she wouldn't be enough. A boggart doesn't lie, it pulls the truth from the deepest part of the soul. For McGonagall, it would never be a monster, it would be her own failure. Her children, yes, children, gone because she couldn't stop it. She could face death, but not theirs, not ever. Number 14, Luna Lovegood, complete loneliness and rejection. The wardrobe creaked open, and for a moment there was nothing. No monster, no scream, just stillness. Then Luna Lovegood stepped forward. The boggart didn't take the form of a spider, a dementor, or a snarling beast. Instead, it revealed a cold, empty room. Grey light spilled through a high window. Dust hung in the air. There were no voices, no laughter, no Xenophilius, her father, no Ginny, Neville, or Harry. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from absence. That was her greatest fear, not death, not pain, but being completely alone and forgotten. Luna had always lived on the edges. Students mocked her behind her back, calling her Loony Lovegood. She wore butterbeer cork necklaces and spoke of creatures no one else believed in. But Luna was more aware than she let on. In Order of the Phoenix, she gently told Harry, I enjoyed the meetings. It was like having friends. That one sentence said more than a dozen conversations. She never demanded inclusion, but she longed for connection. Her boggart, an empty world with no familiar faces, spoke to that hidden ache. She could handle ridicule. What she feared was that no one would care she was gone. Her bond with her father was sacred. After her mother's tragic death, Xenophilius was her universe. He believed in her when others didn't. If Luna faced a boggart and saw that he too was gone, if his voice didn't echo back to her in that empty room, it would strike at her very core. Luna believed in things no one else could see. But this fear, this hollow loneliness, needed no imagination. It was real. The fear that even magic couldn't fill the silence of being forgotten. Luna's brilliance wasn't in books, but in the way she saw people. She comforted Harry after Sirius's death. She stood by Neville in the darkest times. She listened when no one else did. Number 15, Horace Slughorn, Voldemort learning about the Horcruxes. In a quiet corner of the potions classroom at Hogwarts, hidden behind shelves of bubbling elixirs and ancient ingredient jars, Professor Horace Slughorn once stood trembling. To his students, he was a man of warmth, of wit, and of wondrous connections. But beneath the jovial facade was a man racked by guilt, terrified of the one memory he could not erase, the moment he unknowingly handed Tom Riddle the key to immortality. If a boggart had emerged from the cupboard in front of him, it would not take the shape of a spider or ghost. It would transform into something far worse, a vision of Lord Voldemort, Albus Dumbledore, and a host of innocent students, all turning toward him with eyes full of betrayal, realizing that he was the one who had whispered secrets about Horcruxes to a charming, ambitious boy. Slughorn's greatest fear was never death or pain. It was exposure, the shame of truth, the unmasking of a man who had prided himself on discretion, who built his life on careful social maneuvering. In his mind, the worst possible reality was not that he aided Voldemort directly, but that he helped him inadvertently, seduced by the flattery of a brilliant student who made him feel important. The truth, distorted by guilt, loomed like a spectre. He had told Tom Riddle what a Horcrux was. Not just what it was, but that creating multiple Horcruxes might be theoretically possible. He had said too much. Years later, the memory of that conversation haunted him so deeply that he altered his own recollection of the event, modifying it with magic to erase the damning details. When Dumbledore came calling in Half-Blood Prince, the memory he retrieved was a hollow one, stripped of the truth. Slughorn had buried the evidence even from himself. It was not until Harry Potter, armed with Felix Felicis and a surprisingly gentle touch, persuaded him to reveal what truly happened. The original memory was a revelation. In it, Slughorn hesitates, then responds to Tom Riddle's probing questions, saying the words that would chill readers. Well, you must understand that the soul is supposed to remain intact and whole. Splitting it is an act of violation. It is against nature. But even then, he adds, Merlin's beard, Tom, isn't it bad enough to consider killing one person? To rip the soul into 7 pieces? That moment, now recovered, is not just a plot point. It is the core of Slughorn's secret self. He was not an evil man, nor cruel, nor foolish. He was simply vain. He wanted to be admired. Tom Riddle, handsome, magnetic, brilliant, played him like a violin. Slughorn offered him the knowledge not out of malice, but because he enjoyed the gleam in the boy's eyes when he called him Sir with such reverence. It made him feel powerful. And later, when he saw what Riddle had become, when he heard of the murders, the dark rise, the mutilated soul, he realized that he had played a role, however small, in the making of a monster. This is what the boggart would show, not Voldemort's wrath, but Voldemort's indifference, as he acknowledges Slughorn's contribution, Dumbledore's disappointment, not in anger, but in quiet sorrow, and worse than both, his students, those innocent, wide-eyed faces shrinking back from him as the truth unfolds. The room would be cold, heavy with silence, their eyes fixed upon him, as if he were no better than the Dark Lord himself. The vision would not be theatrical. It would be personal, cutting deep into the core of who Slughorn believed himself to be. Slughorn built his life around connections, not out of pure ambition, but because he saw potential in people. He was the kind of man who wanted to be remembered as a mentor to the greats. He collected students the way others collected rare coins, Lily Evans, Gwenog Jones, Barnabas Cuff. He gave them dinner invitations, praised them lavishly, and stored their achievements like trophies. But deep down he feared that history would not remember him as a teacher of brilliance, but as the fool who helped the darkest wizard of all time gain power. His fear is not entirely unfounded. In the world of magic, intent is often blurred. The line between innocence and complicity is thin. Though Slughorn never cast a killing curse, he enabled a conversation that changed the course of magical history. The fact that he had to be tricked, persuaded, cajoled into revealing the memory speaks volumes. He had lived with the shame so long it became a part of his identity. To reveal it meant stripping himself bare. It meant admitting to Dumbledore, to Harry, to himself, that he had failed. There is something inherently tragic in Slughorn's psychology. He's not a man driven by evil, but by fear. Not the fear of physical harm, but of moral consequence. He ran from Hogwarts when Voldemort returned, disguising himself, hiding in Muggle towns. He brewed potions in rented rooms, never staying in one place too long, not because he thought he would be killed, but because he could not bear the idea of being used again, or worse, of facing the legacy of his mistake. The shame weighed heavier than any threat. The boggart, that cruel creature of dark magic, would sense this. It would not roar or threaten, it would simply recreate the moment of truth, when Dumbledore lifts his eyes and says softly, "Horace, you told him." When Voldemort, with a cold smirk, calls him Professor, as if relishing the irony. When a student like Hermione Granger recoils, whispering to Ron, He knew what it meant." And Slughorn in the centre of it all, sweating, shrinking, unable to speak. Number 16, Molly Weasley, dead children, and husband. The room was dim, cluttered with the oddities of Grimmauld Place, shadows flickering against the peeling wallpaper. It was in that forsaken hallway closet where a shape-shifting nightmare emerged, one that, even in a world of magic, struck a note of deep, soul-wrenching sorrow. When Molly Weasley faced her boggart in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, it did not materialize as a spider, nor as a dragon, nor as a Dementor. Instead, it became her children, dead one after another. The scene unfolded not with theatrical flair, but with intimate, unbearable grief. Here was a woman often seen as the rock of the burrow, dissolving under the weight of a fear so primal, so human, it made even the hardened members of the Order hesitate. In that moment we were reminded that behind the cosy knit sweaters, the endless cooking, and the loving scolds, Molly Weasley carried the emotional burden of the Second Wizarding War more heavily than anyone imagined. Her boggart was not abstract. It did not reflect fear of humiliation or loneliness or monsters in the dark. It was something so viscerally maternal that it caught everyone, including Harry, completely off guard. "No!" she cried again and again, her wand trembling as the boggart transformed from Ron's lifeless body to Bill's, then to Fred and George's, then to Percy's, and finally to Harry's. Even her husband Arthur was not spared. What made this scene so deeply affecting was not just the horror of the images, but the strength of the truth behind them. Molly had already lost family to war. Her brothers, Fabian and Gideon Prewett, had died fighting Death Eaters. That history whispered silently behind her, bleeding into her every gesture of care, every frantic attempt to make the burrow feel like home. The boggart was more than a magical threat. It was a mirror of her suppressed trauma and the unspoken terror that another war would rob her of what little remained. There is a peculiar pain in being the glue of a family during times of chaos. Molly never saw herself as a soldier, yet she fought daily, not with a wand, but with love, food, warmth, and unwavering presence. Her boggart, in all its haunting transformations, exposed how deeply that role cost her. The wizarding world was fraying again, inching back toward the same violence that had once shattered her life, and all she could do was hold her children closer and hope the tide wouldn't pull them under. J.K. Rowling could have chosen any number of fears for Molly: failure, insignificance, abandonment. But she chose the death of her children because Molly was not just a character, she was the embodiment of family. And in a series that revolved around lost parents and fractured lineages, Molly was a symbol of what still endured. The sight of her boggart unravelling into a pile of imaginary corpses wasn't just upsetting, it was a reminder of how much she held together and how close it all was to falling apart. "Ridiculous!" she attempted to cry over and over, her voice cracking, her wand ineffective. It was not just that she couldn't cast the spell, it was that she couldn't imagine anything funny about death. The boggart's power was broken not by humour, but by compassion, when Lupin entered the room and calmly removed the burden from her. But the damage was already done. The curtain had lifted on Molly's inner world, and what we saw was heartbreaking. This scene served as a narrative pivot. Until that moment, the war had mostly been seen through the lens of prophecy, politics, and danger to the chosen one. But Molly's boggart grounded the conflict in something deeply personal. She had no prophecy to fulfill. She wasn't carrying the weight of a chosen destiny. Her burden was simply to survive with her family intact, and the fear that she might not be able to do that tore her apart. In a story full of magical battles, Molly reminded us that some of the most terrifying struggles happen far from the battlefield, in quiet kitchens and sleepless nights. The strength of Molly Weasley lies in how she loves. That love is not abstract or sentimental. It is manifested in action. She knits jumpers with initials, cooks more food than any family could possibly consume, and scolds her children with a voice sharp from fear. These aren't quirks, they are rituals of protection. Her every act of care is a ward against the chaos she cannot control. And the boggart exposed the one truth she couldn't admit even to herself, that she might do everything right, love them with her entire soul, and still lose them anyway. When Harry watched her crumble, he saw for the first time the emotional cost of the war on adults. He had known Molly as a surrogate mother, a woman who offered him kindness without expectation. But that night he realized that she carried him in her heart, too, that she feared for him as one of her own. His name appearing among the lifeless bodies shown by the boggart was not a narrative accident. It was an act of quiet storytelling that confirmed what had only been hinted at before. Molly had folded Harry into her family not out of pity, but out of profound, unconditional love. The image of Ron's lifeless body was especially jarring for Harry. Ron had always been the one to make light of danger, to joke and complain, to bumble his way through every tight spot. To see him portrayed as dead, silent, still, was the antithesis of everything Ron represented. For Molly, it was the unspeakable. For Harry, it was the unimaginable. The boggart shattered that illusion. War would not spare the joyful, the young, or the beloved. It would devour them all if allowed. And yet, Molly never succumbed to bitterness. That is perhaps the most powerful thing about her. Even after this harrowing encounter, she didn't retreat. She did not close herself off. Instead, she returned to what she always did, baking, comforting, nurturing, and fiercely protecting those she loved. The boggart hadn't broken her. It had revealed her, and the strength that emerged from that vulnerability was staggering. Number 17, Peter Pettigrew, being exposed by his friends. In the dim corridors of fear, where every witch and wizard must confront their deepest horror, the boggart waits. It lingers not in shadows, but in the silence before truth. For Peter Pettigrew, known to many as Wormtail, known to a few as the traitor, it is not the Dark Lord's fury he dreads most, nor death, nor the Dementor's kiss. No, his boggart would be simpler and infinitely crueler. Three figures, once friends, now lit by the cold, furious light of judgment: James Potter, Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin. Picture it. A creaking wardrobe door opens in a forgotten classroom. There, in the shifting gloom, the boggart senses the air of Pettigrew's fears. And it changes, its limbs twitch and reform, its face twists and merges into three. Not monsters, not beasts, but men. James stands tall, his hair windswept, eyes blazing with betrayal. Sirius is beside him, lips curled not in a sneer, but in something more venomous, disgust. And Remus, solemn as ever, looks not angry, but deeply, profoundly disappointed. No curses, no wands, just their presence and the searing truth it brings. For Peter, this moment is unbearable. It is the collapse of the illusion he has spent a lifetime maintaining. Peter Pettigrew was never the strongest, nor the cleverest. At Hogwarts, he followed James and Sirius like a loyal hound, desperate to be included. He laughed at their jokes, joined in their mischief, and clung to their charisma like ivy clings to stone. Yet beneath that devotion grew something rotten, not envy, though that festered too, but terror. He feared being left behind. Peter's need to belong was so great that he reshaped his very soul around others, sacrificing any fragment of identity just to remain close to power. Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices that show what we truly are." Peter's choice was always the same: submission. Even when they became animagi, James the noble stag, Sirius the proud dog, and Peter the small cowering rat, the symbolism was not lost. A rat scurries, it hides, it survives by vanishing when danger arises and reappearing when the coast is clear. While his friends embraced transformation for loyalty, Peter's transformation would become his curse. He would use it to escape, to spy, to betray, and he would never again be able to look into their eyes without seeing that truth reflected back. The night of James and Lily's death cemented Peter's place in history, not as a friend, but as a Judas. He had convinced them through trembling lips and feigned humility to make him their secret keeper. "Who would suspect me?" he had said, as though cowardice were a virtue. But that very cowardice guided his every move. The moment Voldemort offered him safety in exchange for a name, Peter gave it, not out of ideology, not even greed, just fear, that suffocating, blinding fear that had ruled his life since youth. And what did it gain him? The dark mark burned on his arm, but no glory followed. Voldemort never respected him. Even in exile, even as a spectral whisper in the forbidden forest of Albania, Voldemort called him servant. His presence was tolerated, not welcomed. He became the caretaker of a soul too monstrous to die and too weak to live. And Peter clung to it, believing that in service he might find safety. Yet the irony was bitter. The man who betrayed his friends to avoid fear now lived in it every day. When Sirius Black escaped Azkaban, Peter's world cracked open once more. Disguised as Scabbers, he had spent 12 years in the pocket of another boy, Ron Weasley, hiding among children, feeding off crumbs, trembling at every cat's paw. The very existence of Crookshanks haunted him. It was not Voldemort's enemies that terrified him then, it was exposure. He feared the moment his mask would be pulled away, the moment Ron's rat would vanish, and Wormtail would be forced to meet the gaze of those he betrayed. And that moment came, cruel and poetic, in the shrieking shack. There, beneath the splintering timbers and swirling dust, Peter's world fell. The wand pointed at him was not Voldemort's, it was Harry's, the son of the friend he had murdered. Remus and Sirius stood flanking him, not as shadows of his fear, but as judges in flesh. "You sold James and Lily to Voldemort," Sirius said, the words a knife. And Peter, whimpering, shuddering, offered no defense. He knew there was none. The boggart would show this moment again and again, not the shack, not the bindings or threats, but the eyes that looked at him and saw nothing but cowardice. In the end, Peter's most defining trait was not wickedness, it was weakness. When given a chance to defy Voldemort and reclaim some shred of dignity, he failed. Even as his silver hand, the gift from Voldemort, strangled him in the basement of Malfoy Manor, he hesitated. In that final breath, some fragment of his soul remembered mercy. He spared Harry's life. And for that moment of rebellion, Voldemort's enchantment turned on him. It was not the hand of a man, it was the executioner's tool, activated by a failure of obedience. There is a peculiar cruelty to Peter's fate. He was not a grand villain. He was not a genius nor a tyrant. He was a boy who feared being left behind. And in that fear he left everyone else. His boggart reflects that perfectly, not death, but judgment. For it is in the eyes of those who once loved him that Peter sees the sharpest blade. The boggart, unlike a dementor, does not drain your happiness. It reveals the mirror you fear to look into. The Marauder's map, a product of their friendship, once read Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. It was meant to be a testament to brotherhood. Yet even that artifact turned into a bitter reminder. When Harry used it, he saw the names of the dead and the betrayed flickering across parchment. Wormtail, still scuttling in the shadows. Moony, scarred by grief. Padfoot, imprisoned. Prongs, a name now only echoed in memories and battle cries. Peter's presence there was not camaraderie, it was a ghost of betrayal encoded in magic. Number 18, Fred and George Weasley, The Death of the Other Twin. Fred and George Weasley were born together, grew up together, and dreamed together. From the moment they appeared in the pages of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, they were rarely seen apart. Mischievous, brilliant, and full of laughter, they were the architects of chaos and joy in equal measure. Yet beneath their grinning exteriors and pranks lay something unspoken, something far deeper than jokes could ever convey. Their bond was not just that of brothers. It was a shared soul, split into two bodies. To imagine a boggart confronting one of them is to imagine that which they feared most, life without the other. In the quiet corridors of the burrow, or the empty shelves of their shop after closing, one could imagine Fred pausing just for a second if left alone. George was never far, but in that instant, a flicker of thought might cross Fred's mind. What if George wasn't there? And in that dreadful moment, if a boggart slithered out of a cupboard, it would twist into the image of George lying still, eyes empty, freckles paling. Fred, who made others laugh even in danger, would have no punchline for this sight. The joke would have ended. To George, the fear cut no less deep. The idea of Fred's absence was not merely sorrow, it was unthinkable disorientation. The two operated as one. From the moment they enchanted snowballs to hit Professor Quirrell's turban, to their legendary escape from Hogwarts, they were a singular force. George without Fred was like magic without a wand, empty, unchanneled. If a boggart appeared before George, it would become Fred's motionless body, a silence where laughter should have been. His worst fear wasn't death. It was being left behind by the one person who always stood beside him. Throughout their years at Hogwarts, Fred and George cultivated a reputation that bordered on mythic. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred once called out as they fled the school during Umbridge's reign. They were icons of rebellion and youthful confidence, yet the nature of their humour, so carefully curated and ceaselessly performed, was a shield. Behind each firework, behind every portable swamp, was the quiet understanding that they existed best, perhaps only truly, when they were together. The boggart, that cruel mirror of inner dread, would reflect not a monster or a ghost, but absence. Silence. A brother's death. Even Molly Weasley, their mother, seemed to intuit this. Her boggart, revealed in Order of the Phoenix, cycled through the images of her children dead, Fred, George, Ron, Bill, and so on. For Molly, the fear of losing any of her children was too great to hide, but Fred and George, for all their laughter, might have feared just one death, each other's. "You haven't got a sister?" she once cried, and George responded, "Yeah, but she's got plenty of brothers." That exchange, playful on the surface, hinted at how deeply the Weasleys wove their identities together. The loss of one would unravel them all, especially the twins. When the Battle of Hogwarts broke upon them, Fred and George stood not just as fighters but as symbols of resilience. In the midst of horror, they still managed jokes, still brought levity to the shadows. But Fred's death came like a thunderclap. "And that's the second time we've saved your life tonight, you two-faced bastard," were his final words, flung at Percy in a brief reunion of estranged brothers. Then came the explosion, and Fred fell, still laughing. There was no warning, no lingering, no goodbye. George was shattered. The moment he saw Fred's body, something irreparable cracked within him. It was not just the loss of a brother, but of identity, of voice, of joy. His twin, the other half of every plan, every invention, every sentence, was gone. He was there, George might have thought, remembering the sparkle in Fred's eyes moments before. And now he's not. That instant rewrote the rest of his life. From then on, every joke, every quiet moment would carry Fred's ghost. It is not hard to imagine George encountering a boggart in the aftermath, not in battle, but months later in a silent corridor of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, perhaps while closing up alone for the night. The shop had once echoed with their laughter. Now it whispered Fred's name. The boggart would not need to be inventive. It would simply lie on the floor as Fred had, unbreathing. George would see his own loss made flesh again, and perhaps for a split second, believe it. In Deathly Hallows, George loses more than a brother. Earlier in the story, he literally loses an ear to a curse, another piece of himself. But it was survivable, painful, yes. But Fred's death was something else. Rowling wrote simply, Fred's eyes stared without seeing, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. That image is unbearable. Fred died in the act of being himself. The smile was still there, but the person was gone. In later years, fans speculated that George could never fully recover, that the joke shop lost its luster, that he named his son Fred in tribute, yet couldn't say the name aloud for years. There are no official canon lines for this sorrow. Rowling left the aftermath to imagination. But the pain is there, unspoken and immense. For George, every mirror reflected one face instead of two. Every silence was where Fred's voice should have echoed. Every boggart always would be Fred, dead, unreachable, gone. Fred, had he lived and George died, would have felt no differently. His bravado might have cracked more openly, but the grief would be identical. They shared dreams, ideas, memories. A boggart is shaped by the soul's deepest fracture. For Fred, the image of George's body would be unbearable, his mischief, his planning, his heart, meaningless without George. "We've been hearing explosions out of their room for ages, but we never dared go in," Ron once said. Those explosions were joy, chaos, brotherhood. A boggart, in contrast, would be a quiet body and silence. Their unity was so complete that they often finished each other's sentences. "You haven't got a letter?" said George. "I suppose she's got all the answers now," added Fred, never missing a beat. They moved as one, fought as one, existed as one. A boggart splitting them wouldn't just be a nightmare, it would be an undoing. The joke shop, their life's work, had always been more than merchandise. It was their rebellion, their defiance against fear. It was the physical embodiment of their joy. But after the war, its corners must have grown quieter. George kept it running, perhaps out of duty, to Fred's memory. But something must have faded. One half of the laughter was gone. The swamp at Hogwarts, left behind as a legacy, stood longer than most monuments. But even that was only half of a joke. The other half had been buried. In truth, a boggart confronting the twins wouldn't even need to be gruesome. It could be something painfully mundane, an empty bed, one plate at dinner, a voice missing in a joke. It would be subtle, and that's what would make it terrifying. Because the worst fear for Fred and George was not pain or blood or danger. It was a world where the other simply wasn't there. Harry once described the twins as beacons of light during their time at Hogwarts. In the gloom of Umbridge's reign, it was they who gave the school hope. But even beacons can flicker, even laughter can mask the deepest fears. When facing a boggart, most students saw monsters, teachers, humiliations. But Fred and George would see themselves alone. That was the horror that no spell could banish. Lupin taught them that the way to defeat a boggart was with laughter. "Ridiculous," he said, transforming nightmares into jokes. But what happens when the boggart is a joke gone wrong, when the dead brother still smiles as he did in life? How do you laugh then? Fred and George, masters of comedy, would find themselves defenseless, because there is no laughter without the one who shared it. George, in years after, may have invented new pranks. He may have laughed again, even genuinely, but there would always be moments, quiet, stolen from the public eye. A joke that felt wrong, an idea he could not finish, a product design with two names on the sketch, but only one signing off. Those were the shadows where the boggart lived, coiled and patient. Fred and George were never truly afraid of death. They threw themselves into chaos daily. But they were terrified of something worse, living without the other. When Fred died, it wasn't just a brother lost. It was a magical connection severed, a twin flame extinguished. George had to learn to walk with half a soul. The boggart was never meant to be an enemy, it was a reflection. And for Fred and George, that reflection wasn't just scary, it was prophecy. Because unlike most fears, theirs came true. And no spell, not even ridiculous, could undo it. Number 19, Cho Chang, losing loved ones again. The corridors of Hogwarts had seen more than just spells and secrets. They had witnessed grief woven into the very stones, especially after the Triwizard Tournament. For Cho Chang, a bright and kind-hearted Ravenclaw, the events of that night changed everything. When Cedric Diggory died, something inside her cracked. It was not loud or visible. There was no dramatic cry or burst of light, just a slow erosion of innocence that no spell could ever mend. Before the tragedy, Cho had been a popular student, graceful on a broomstick, intelligent in class, and kind to those around her. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for her quiet strength and empathy. It was these qualities that drew Cedric to her. They had shared stolen glances, brief conversations in the hallways, and eventually a connection that blossomed into something real. They were young, and yet their affection carried the purity that only young love can. But young love is also fragile, and Voldemort shattered it without mercy. Cedric Diggory's death was not just a headline in the Daily Prophet for Cho, it was the loss of warmth, of future plans whispered in secret. The night he died, something followed her back into the Ravenclaw common room. A silence, a numbness, and a haunting guilt that would not let go. Had she asked him to participate? Had she distracted him in some way? She replayed their last conversation again and again, until even her dreams carried the weight of that night. A year later, Professor Lupin's lesson on boggarts was long gone, yet had she stood before one now, it would have chosen the most twisted form imaginable. Cedric standing lifeless, pale, his eyes open, staring through her. But in this nightmarish vision he would not merely appear dead. He would whisper, without words, the accusation she feared the most, that he was gone, and she had stayed, that her laughter was a betrayal, that her moving on was abandonment. For Cho, the fear of loss became a phantom that followed her through every corridor. The castle reminded her of Cedric, every corner of it. The astronomy tower where they once watched the stars, the Quidditch pitch where they cheered for each other, even the library where he'd once jokingly offered to help her find a book on ancient runes just to sit near her. After his death, these places no longer felt magical, they were tombstones. In her 6th year, she tried to move forward. Harry Potter entered her life not just as the boy who lived, but as the boy who survived the night Cedric died. Their shared grief was a fragile thread that connected them, but grief is not a solid foundation for love. Cho kissed Harry in a room filled with memories and secrets, but her tears tasted of loss, not longing. She started crying, Harry later told Ron, confused. And you know what she said? She said she was sorry she'd met me under all this tragedy. Her attempt to move on was sincere, but it was like trying to build a castle on sand. Her heart remained loyal to someone who would never return. Even her friendship strained. Marietta Edgecombe, her closest friend, betrayed the Dumbledore's army to Professor Umbridge. Trust shattered again, another form of loss. Cho began to withdraw, not because she lacked courage, but because each new bond felt like a possible wound waiting to reopen. The boggart would show her what she feared most, not just death, but the solitude that followed. A Cedric, whose eyes stared through her, alive only in her nightmares, symbolized more than loss. It was the embodiment of her fear that loving again meant risking annihilation. That closeness was a gamble, and the price of losing someone again would be unbearable. Loneliness to her wasn't just being physically alone, it was the terrifying echo of memories with no one left to share them. This fear shaped her choices. She became cautious with new friends, quiet in crowds, and hesitant with affection. The girl who once soared on a broomstick now treaded carefully through her days. Even her academic performance suffered, Not drastically, but the sparkle of curiosity was dimmer. She still read, still studied, but the fire was gone. It was as though her heart had built a wall, and her intellect operated in isolation. There were moments of strength, of course. Cho was not weak. She had joined Dumbledore's army, stood up to authority, and defended what she believed in. But even courage does not erase trauma. She was brave in the way a wounded soldier still marches. Her resilience was quiet, unseen by many. She carried her grief like armor, and sometimes that armor weighed more than any shield. One evening she stood in front of the mirror of Erised, not for long, but long enough to see what her heart still yearned for. The reflection showed her with Cedric smiling, holding hands under a starlit sky. Behind them, Hogwarts sparkled, untouched by darkness. It was a vision of innocence reclaimed. But Cho turned away. She knew such a future could never be, and the pain of seeing it, even as an illusion, was sharper than any hex. Her professors noticed the change. Professor Flitwick, who always encouraged her, once remarked with gentle concern, "You've got more on your mind than charms, Miss Chang." But there was nothing he could fix. No incantation for grief, no spell to heal a broken attachment. Love had been her strength, and now it was her wound. And yet in time, she did not let it define her completely. By the time the Battle of Hogwarts came, Cho had made her decision. She returned to fight, not just for Hogwarts or the cause, but for herself. For the part of her that still believed love was worth defending, even if it hurt. In that moment, she was no longer hiding behind grief. She embraced it, carried it with her, and still chose to act. That was her defiance, her own quiet brand of heroism. After the war, she did not immediately move on. She allowed herself the space to grieve fully, without rushing to replace what was lost. Eventually, she pursued a career in magical education, focusing on emotional resilience in young witches and wizards. She taught them that healing was not linear, and that it was okay to be afraid of loss, as long as you didn't let it stop you from living. In that classroom, she found her peace. When asked, years later, what she feared most, Cho answered honestly, to care deeply and be left behind. But she also added, "And yet I choose to care, because the alternative is worse." That honesty, more than any one movement, was her true strength. She had faced her boggart, even if not in a classroom. She had lived through it. Her story became an example for others, especially for those who had lost someone too soon. She never wrote memoirs, never sought the spotlight. But those who knew her remembered her warmth, her patience, and her ability to look someone in the eye and say, "I understand." Because she did. In the end, Cho Chang was not just the girl who loved Cedric Diggory, she was the girl who survived him. And though her boggart may always carry his face, she learned to meet it with steady breath and quiet strength. Fear never left her, but it no longer controlled her. That, perhaps, was her greatest magic. Number 20. Sybill Trelawney, her normal self without any magical gift. In the candle-lit tower room that smelled faintly of burnt herbs and stale sherry, Sybill Trelawney hovered like a spirit trapped between worlds. With her massive glasses magnifying her eyes to the point of otherworldliness and layers of shawls draping her figure like theatrical curtains, she cultivated an image of someone forever teetering on the brink of a prophecy. But for all her eccentric performances and drifting manner of speech, there was a deeper, darker truth beneath the swirling veils and scented smoke. Her greatest fear, if it ever took the shape of a boggart, would not be some beast or monster, but herself stripped of all pretense, an ordinary woman, unremarkable, forgotten. It is easy to dismiss Trelawney as comic relief within the halls of Hogwarts, and many did. Minerva McGonagall, always grounded in logic and results, rolled her eyes at Sybill's dramatic predictions. "You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will forgive me if I don't let you off homework today," she said dryly, after one of Trelawney's more dire declarations. Students whispered and snickered as she made vague predictions about doom and death every term. But they never questioned why she kept returning to that word, death. To Sybill, the fear was not of dying. It was of becoming invisible. She was descended from Cassandra Trelawney, a celebrated seer of her time, which only added pressure. The expectation to live up to her bloodline burdened her soul. If she had no gift, then she was not only a fraud, but a failed legacy. Sybill's whole persona seemed like a defense mechanism, a performance she had to maintain lest the truth come crashing through the stained glass of her illusion. If magic was stripped away, what remained? A woman in plain robes, without incense, without the haze of prophecy. A woman no one would listen to. That was her boggart. One cannot understand Trelawney's fear without considering how often it was mirrored back to her. When Dolores Umbridge descended upon Hogwarts with her arsenal of clipboards and sadism, Sybill was one of the first casualties. "You are incapable of teaching," Umbridge declared, before sacking her in the courtyard like discarded luggage. At that moment, stripped of her position and her stage, Trelawney broke. She became the woman she feared, powerless, trembling, and watched by all. Even in that moment of public shame, her eyes searched the sky, perhaps for some celestial sign that she was still meant to matter. Yet Albus Dumbledore, ever the reader of hearts, restored her room and her dignity. He knew what others didn't, that Sybill Trelawney had once channeled a true prophecy, though she herself had no memory of it. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches," she had said, in a voice not her own, her body shaking as if possessed. It was not theatre, it was truth. In that moment, Sybill was more than credible, she was crucial. But because she could not recall it, she remained haunted by uncertainty. Was she a seer, or simply a vessel, a prophet, or a puppet? What makes Trelawney's fear more poignant is how close it clings to self-awareness. Unlike Gilderoy Lockhart, who believed his own fiction until it consumed him, Sybill seemed dimly aware that her dramatic flair might be compensation. Her choice of classroom, perched in a tower far from others, mirrored her inner isolation. She wrapped herself in scarves and smoke, not only to impress, but to hide, to create a mystique so strong that even she might believe in it. Her boggart, in that sense, would be devastating. Not a scream, but a quiet undoing, a slow deconstruction of identity until only the bones of ordinariness remained. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when she predicted the grim in Harry's future, it was laughed off as another of her gloomy guesses. But she had indeed seen something, his connection with death, perhaps even the shadow of Sirius Black. It didn't matter that her words were vague. They came from a place of deep intuition, which she could never fully control. The gift flickered in her like a candle in a storm, sometimes bright, sometimes snuffed. The fear of being just a woman pretending by candlelight haunted her steps. Even Professor Firenze, the centaur with his own knowledge of the stars, noted her fragility. "Human minds are ill-equipped to interpret the signs of the stars," he said, yet showed her a form of reluctant respect. Sybill, for all her fragility, carried something he did not, the madness of belief. She believed so deeply in her purpose that it became real. Her fear was not rooted in external judgment, but in internal collapse. That one morning she might wake up, look in the mirror, and see only Sybill. No prophecies, no future, no past, just a woman who failed to matter. When Harry witnessed her true prophecy in Dumbledore's pensive, he saw the reason she had been kept at Hogwarts, protected even when others dismissed her. Sybill Trelawney was for a fleeting moment the hinge upon which the war turned. She had named the child who would bring about Voldemort's fall. She had created the very condition of the prophecy's self-fulfillment. Without knowing it, she had shaped destiny, and yet that knowledge was locked away from her conscious mind. Like a painter who can no longer see their own work, she was left in doubt. The tragedy of Sybill Trelawney is that her fear was not false. It had a basis in her life. She was ridiculed by her peers, ignored by her students, and cast aside by the ministry. She clung to her incense and crystal balls, not as tools, but as shields. Her boggart, the plain woman in drab robes, standing silently with nothing to say, would be more terrifying to her than any beast. It would confirm her deepest suspicion that she had never mattered at all. Trelawney's time in the Room of Requirement during the Battle of Hogwarts, hurling crystal balls with surprising accuracy, showed a different side of her. She had courage. Not the roaring Gryffindor type, but the kind that blooms in silence. Even as the walls trembled and death walked the halls, she fought to defend the castle that had both mocked and sheltered her. That bravery perhaps was not born of confidence, but of defiance against her own fear. The boggart metaphor, in her case, reveals something deeper about the human condition. Many fear monsters, but the most profound fear is self-erasure. What if we are not who we claim to be? What if beneath the symbols and accolades we are just ordinary? For Sybill, the boggart would not hiss or lunge. It would simply appear still, unremarkable, and eerily familiar. It would be herself, without the mask. And that, for her, was horror. It is easy to forget that Hogwarts was not just a school for the magically gifted, but a sanctuary for the spiritually broken. Dumbledore saw her need for purpose and offered her refuge. In return, she gave the world one of its most fateful utterances. Yet because she couldn't recall it, the weight of doubt festered. The boggart of self-doubt took many forms: disdainful glances, snide remarks, her own trembling voice. But its truest shape was quiet, unremarkable, and deadly in its simplicity. The defense against the dark arts class, where boggarts were often encountered, was never a space Sybill would choose to inhabit. For someone like her, defense was internal. She battled every day against the whisper that she was unneeded, that her tower was a prison of her own making. The real boggart would meet her in a mirror or in silence, and it would wear her face. When one considers the use of boggarts in the series, they often reflect immediate fears: spiders, dementors, severed limbs. But Trelawney's is existential. Her terror is not of dying, but of never having truly lived as she believed she did. Her worst nightmare would be discovering that her life had been a stage play in which she was both actor and audience, applauding an empty performance. This fear gives her character a gravity that often goes unacknowledged. Beneath the teacups and trembling hands lies a woman searching desperately for affirmation, not from others, but from herself. A woman who peered into the mists, not just to divine the future, but to find herself. She spoke once of the inner eye as if it were a mystical organ only some could open. For Sybill, it was both a gift and a burden. To see without proof, to speak without certainty, to believe without being believed. The possibility that her inner eye was blind, that her visions were mere dreams, was her hell. That's what her boggart would whisper. You were never special. In a way, Sybill Trelawney's arc is a mirror to every person who has tried to create meaning in a world that might not listen. She lived wrapped in symbols, but her truth was painfully human. Her fear was not of the grim or the veil of death, but of being just another name forgotten in the margins of history. And yet, in a twist worthy of fate, she was the voice that named the chosen one. Perhaps it is fitting that she never truly knew, because to know might have shattered her. Or worse, it might have proved her right, only once. And that, too, would be a tragedy. For someone like Sybill, the worst fate is not being wrong, but being right once, and then never again. So if one were to open the wardrobe, face the boggart, and see a plain woman with no gift, no prophecy, no purpose, it would not lunge or howl. It would simply stand there, silent, and Sybill would break, because to her that was the face of the void, a void that deep down she feared lived within her all along. Number 21, Dolores Umbridge, Muggle officials running the Ministry. In the shadowed halls of the Ministry of Magic, where whispers pass like ghosts between pillars of bureaucracy, Dolores Umbridge sat in her lace-curtained office with a teacup in her pink-gloved hands, cloaked not in warmth, but in the chill of rigid tradition. Her smile, sweet as poisoned sugar, rarely faltered, yet beneath it lurked a fear far deeper than the common dread of dark wizards or death itself. Dolores Jane Umbridge, senior undersecretary to the minister and former Hogwarts High Inquisitor, did not fear dragons, dementors, or even Voldemort. What truly terrified her was a future she could not control, a ministry led by muggles, cluttered with unfamiliar values and dirtied by bloodlines she considered impure. To understand this fear, one must remember that Umbridge did not simply serve the ministry, she idolized it. The institution to her was more than a workplace. It was a shrine of order, hierarchy, and proper magical lineage. She operated like a high priestess, preserving what she saw as the sanctity of a world in which witches and wizards of appropriate breeding held dominion over not only magic, but morality. Her obsession with rules and decorum was not a quirk. It was a defense mechanism, a wall against chaos, against change. But what if that wall crumbled? Imagine, in the dusty recesses of the Department of Mysteries, a boggart slithering from an ancient cabinet when Umbridge, perhaps inspecting magical artifacts for dangerous, subversive tendencies, stumbled upon it. With her wand raised, smug and certain, she expects perhaps a centaur or a dark wizard. But the boggart senses deeper. It shivers and twists and then blooms into its truest form. Not a monster, but a scene. A row of well-dressed muggles seated in ministerial chairs, their fingers ink-stained from drafting new legislation. Behind them, ministry banners flutter not with the seal of the Wizengamot, but with a reimagined crest, half wand, half pen. They do not acknowledge her. In her worst nightmare, muggles do not just exist, they govern. This imagined boggart reveals more than prejudice. It reveals a soul terrified of power slipping beyond its reach. For Umbridge, power was never merely a means to influence. It was salvation, control, and identity. When Cornelius Fudge began to lose favor, she aligned herself not with truth, but with whoever could restore her sense of order, even if that meant upholding lies, torturing students, or aiding a regime that jailed innocents. Her morality was flexible, so long as her superiority remained intact. Her fear of muggles in power speaks volumes about her worldview. She did not simply believe that muggles were inferior. She feared what their rise symbolized, the erosion of centuries-old structures built to elevate purebloods and suppress others. The vision of a ministry overrun by non-magical officials wasn't just offensive to her. It was apocalyptic. A future where her rules held no weight, her lineage no value, and her polite cruelty no audience. Consider the way she treated Hermione Granger, a muggle-born and one of the most brilliant witches of her generation. Umbridge's disdain was palpable. Her punishments, especially the cursed quill that carved words into Hermione's skin, were not random acts of sadism, but calculated attempts to break the will of someone who symbolized everything she feared. Hermione was proof that bloodline did not determine worth. That knowledge and talent could bloom outside the sacred walls of wizarding families. To Umbridge, Hermione was not just a student. She was a warning. Her boggart confirms it. It isn't Lord Voldemort that keeps her awake at night. It is the thought of a democracy of minds replacing her aristocracy of names. It is the sound of Muggle policies reshaping the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It is a world where centaurs and goblins might be considered citizens, not creatures. Where Harry Potter, defiant, half-blooded Harry, becomes more influential than any pure-blood bureaucrat. In that world, Dolores has no place. Her defense of the system was never truly about law or justice. As revealed in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, she manipulated the Educational Decree 24 not for safety, but to silence Dumbledore's army. She created the Inquisitorial Squad not to protect, but to surveil and suppress. Her goal was not education, but indoctrination. She feared what independent thought might bring. She feared what truth might undo. The hypocrisy of her fear lies in her own bloodline. J.K. Rowling later revealed that Dolores was herself of half-blood heritage, though she publicly denied it. Her father was a wizard, her mother a muggle, and her younger brother was a squib. She despised them, cast them out, built a false lineage around herself to maintain the illusion of purity. This rejection of her roots speaks not to pride, but to panic, a frantic erasure of any connection to the muggle world, lest it contaminate her sense of self. She feared what she could not erase. There is something poetic in the boggart taking the form of muggles in ministry chairs. These figures do not scream or menace. They simply exist. Quiet. Paperwork in hand. Laws to pass. That is what terrifies Umbridge, a quiet revolution, not waged in battle but in policy. Not fought with wands, but with ideas. It is the future knocking politely on the office door, and her refusal to answer. When Umbridge was dragged into the Forbidden Forest by centaurs, many readers felt a sense of justice. Yet even this scene is steeped in irony. Her fear of magical creatures, though irrational, was a metaphor for her fear of the untamable. Centaurs represented autonomy, unpredictability, nature. They rejected her orders not because they were cruel, but because they had no place for her authority. In the ministry, her power was absolute. In the forest, it meant nothing. That contrast shattered her. Later, when she returned to power under Voldemort's regime, her fear transformed into cruelty. She processed muggle-born witches and wizards in kangaroo courts, branding them as thieves of magic. She sent innocent people to Azkaban. Yet her office remained pink. Cats mewed from porcelain plates. Her cruelty did not wear dark robes. It wore a cardigan. Her terror did not come from nightmares. It lived in daytime decorum. The boggart, then, is not just an image of fear. It is a reflection of her soul. For Remus Lupin, it was the moon. For Neville Longbottom, it was Professor Snape. For Dolores Umbridge, it is change, dressed in muggle suits, holding pens instead of wands. Her magic cannot undo them. Her rules cannot bind them. They look at her with the calm indifference of progress. They do not shout. They vote. It is crucial to remember that Umbridge was never a Death Eater. She was worse in some ways. She did not need a dark mark to justify her cruelty. She acted in the name of law, of order, of tradition. Voldemort thrived on chaos. Umbridge thrived on structure. In the words of Albus Dumbledore, you are blinded by the love of your own authority. That blindness was not born of arrogance alone, but of dread, the dread of being obsolete. In a rare moment during Deathly Hallows, when Harry sees her presiding over a sham trial, he notes that she wears a locket, Slytherin's locket, not because she understands its magic, but because it makes her feel powerful. It is a symbol not of heritage but of desperation, a talisman to shield her from the rising tide of a world she cannot control. Yet even the locket cannot protect her from what she sees in that boggart. The real horror for Dolores Umbridge was never monsters. It was meaninglessness, a future where her memos are irrelevant, her robes outdated, her name forgotten, a future where the magical and non-magical worlds converge, not in violence, but in cooperation. Where rules are rewritten and the seat of power is not draped in lace, but in truth. In such a world, there is no place for her pink walls, her quills of punishment, or her selective morality. She believed the ministry would always belong to her kind, pure, proud, and pitiless. But history, both magical and mundane, tells a different story. And perhaps even in that boggart-induced moment, Dolores Jane Umbridge understood what was coming, not with a bang, but with a ballot, not with rebellion, but reform, and that, more than any dark spell, is what chilled her to the bone. Number 22, Lily Potter, Voldemort standing over Harry. Lily Potter stood between life and death with her heart already decided. The moment that would become legend was, in truth, the culmination of everything she had feared most. Though readers never see her encounter a boggart directly, we can almost hear the whisper of its transformation. not into a lifeless corpse, not into fire or darkness, but into the tall, skeletal figure of Lord Voldemort, wand raised, his cold, red eyes fixed on the small form of her son, Harry. That moment, frozen in terror and love, would be her greatest fear. And it was real. Her boggart, if it had ever materialized, would not have needed to imagine. It merely had to remember. Lily's life had been one of sharp contrasts. Brilliance and compassion, courage and vulnerability. At Hogwarts, she had been the brightest of her year, admired for her intellect, and yet remembered most for her kindness. She had befriended Severus Snape when no one else dared to approach him. She had spoken out when James Potter had strutted too far. But beyond her defiant words and quick wand, Lily's greatest strength was always her heart. And so, when the war engulfed the wizarding world and choices became final, it was her heart that determined her path. In Godric's Hollow, on that last Halloween night, Lily's worst nightmare became reality. She knew Voldemort was coming. She had heard the prophecy, felt its weight in every breath. Harry was the boy spoken of, the one who could bring about the Dark Lord's downfall. But before prophecy, before destiny, there was just a mother and her child. Lily didn't see a savior. She saw her baby, barely able to walk, clutching her finger with tiny hands. The fear of losing him had never left her, but that night it consumed her. When Voldemort entered their home, it was James who first tried to hold him back. James, ever brave, was unarmed, taken down in an instant, but Lily, holding Harry in her arms upstairs, refused to run. There was no point. She had already made her choice, and that choice, the one the boggart would have shown her, over and over again, was the moment she stood in front of the crib and begged, not for her own life, only for Harry's. Voldemort offered her a way out. "Stand aside, girl," he had hissed more than once. The Dark Lord was not merciful, but he could be strategic. Snape had pleaded for her life. Lily could have lived, but only if she let him take her child. That was the moment her deepest fear became solid. Voldemort looming, wand drawn, standing over Harry. That was what shattered her heart. And yet she did not move. It is no coincidence that J.K. Rowling's narrative anchors so much power in that sacrifice. Lily's fear was not paralyzing, it was transformative. She feared Voldemort, yes, but only in what he could do to her son. Her death became an enchantment, ancient and rare, casting a protection upon Harry that even Voldemort could not break. As Dumbledore later explained, he gave you a choice, and she did not take it. The choice was to die, and that choice saved Harry. Lily's boggart, then, is more than a vision. It is a memory etched in magic, a spectre of the moment that defined her. For some, a boggart becomes a snake or a ghost or a failing grade. For Lily, it would have been the inevitability of Voldemort's attack on her child, the moment when all her power would not be enough, not because she was weak, but because he was only a baby and she could not run. She had once been known as one of the finest students Slughorn had ever taught. She brewed potions with precision, and her charms work had been lauded, but no spell could protect her son in that final instant. She was not blind to this. She knew Voldemort would come. She knew there would be no escape. Still she hoped. Still she prepared. And in those last moments, she chose not to flee, not to fight, but to plead, because a mother's plea in the end had more power than any wand. We know from Remus Lupin's encounter with the boggart that these manifestations cut deeper than any curse. Lupin's greatest fear was the moon, a monthly reminder of his curse. Molly Weasley's boggart turned into the corpses of her children. The boggart reflects the soul's most vulnerable point. In Lily's case, the boggart would show her not her own death, but the moment before it, the moment when Voldemort raised his wand at her child, and she stood, shaking, knowing she would fall. The real cruelty of such a boggart is that it would replay endlessly what Lily experienced once in life. It would remind her that she had been powerless to stop the killing curse. But the irony, the miracle, is that her seeming powerlessness became the greatest weapon against Voldemort. The ancient magic of self-sacrifice sealed Harry with protection. That is why Quirrell burned when he touched the boy, why Voldemort was flung back, why Harry survived. James Potter's love for Lily was real, but his boggart might have taken a different form. Perhaps Lily herself dead, or Harry gone. But James, though brave, was impulsive. He had once bullied others to protect his pride. He had learned love later. Lily, by contrast, was born with it. Her heart was never for herself. It beat for others. And in the final equation, that made all the difference. When Harry saw his mother through the resurrection stone during the final battle, she did not speak of fear, she did not speak of regret. She stood with calm, as if the storm of death had long passed her. But if the boggart had ever appeared to her in life, she would have been reduced to silence. What words could answer the sight of Voldemort over your child? What charm could banish that vision? In Snape's memories, shared through the pensive, we see glimpses of the girl who grew into that woman. Lily, standing up to bullies. Lily, arguing with Severus over dark magic. Lily, crying when friendships broke. All of it leads to her final act, the act that defies logic, curses, and death itself. The boggart in that case is not just her fear, it is her moment of truth. There is something haunting in the fact that we never see Lily alive in the series. She is present only in echoes, photographs, memories, shadows in a mirror, and yet she casts the longest shadow of all. Every time Harry faces death, Lily is there. Every time he chooses love over vengeance, she is there. The Patronus he conjures is not his own. It is hers, the doe, silent and watchful, lingering in the forest. Perhaps the most powerful indication of Lily's inner world comes not from her actions, but from what they inspired. Severus Snape, bitter and broken, spent his life protecting her son because of a love he could never reclaim. Dumbledore, haunted by past mistakes, built an entire defense strategy around the spell her sacrifice enabled. Voldemort himself was undone, not by wand work or prophecy, but by the fear that what he could not understand, love, might be stronger than death. For Lily, the boggart was not a creature to be laughed at. There was no ridiculous spell that could make it less terrifying. There was no wardrobe to trap it in. Her boggart came to life in flesh and shadow, and she faced it without a wand in her hand. That is the very definition of courage, to face your deepest fear, not because you expect to win, but because you cannot bear to step aside. Harry never knew his mother's voice. He never felt her arms after that night, but her fear, and more importantly, her defiance of it, shaped the boy he became. And when he faced Voldemort years later in the Forbidden Forest, wand lowered, ready to die, he did so with the same fire that had burned in Lily. He, too, made the choice to die for others. He, too, feared for those he loved more than he feared his own death. The boggart, had it dared to take Lily's form, would have shown her the price of love, but it would not have broken her. Because the essence of Lily's character is that she did not break, not when Snape called her mudblood, not when the war claimed her friends, and not when death stood in her nursery. She chose to fear the right thing, not death, but the death of the innocent. The image of Voldemort raising his wand over Harry is terrifying. But to Lily, it was not abstract. It was the reason she stood her ground. And that is why the boggart would never have made her run. It would have made her weep, perhaps, or tremble. But she would face it, as she did in life, and it would vanish, not with a spell, but with a mother's final breath turned into something eternal. And so, Lily's boggart is more than fear. It is prophecy, memory, and sacrifice rolled into one. It is the moment that changed the world, and though we never see her laugh it away or trap it in a box, we know that she met it, full in the face, and we know, too, that she won, number 24, Aberforth Dumbledore, Albus and Grindelwald united. Again. Of all the shadowed figures haunting the margins of the Harry Potter saga, Aberforth Dumbledore stands as one of the most complex. While his older brother Albus is revered as the greatest wizard of his time, Aberforth is painted as stubborn, gruff, and fiercely private. Yet within this stoic silhouette lies a deeply wounded man, one who has borne the weight of grief, betrayal, and bitter disillusionment for decades. If a boggart ever took shape before Aberforth, it would not become a mere spider or spectre, but a vision more intimate and painful. Albus and Gellert Grindelwald, standing side by side once more, united not in brotherhood, but in ambition. Aberforth's life was irrevocably changed by the events of his youth. When his mother, Kendra, died in a tragic accident caused by their sister Ariana's unstable magic, Aberforth was barely more than a boy. The responsibility of care fell heavily on his shoulders. He loved Ariana deeply, understood her fragility, and watched over her with the devotion of a guardian. Albus, though equally affected, quickly shifted focus. He found himself drawn to the charismatic and visionary Gellert Grindelwald, whose ideology of wizarding dominance and the greater good swept Albus into a storm of intellectual and emotional fervour. To Aberforth, this was abandonment. Not only did Albus seem to forget his family duties, he became entranced by a philosophy that Aberforth instinctively distrusted. He saw Grindelwald not as a genius, but as a danger. He knew the cost of power when it came at the expense of love and loyalty. When he discovered Albus and Gellert plotting to create a new world order where Muggles would be subjugated for their own good, Aberforth was horrified. He confronted them, he fought them, and in the chaos of their legendary duel, Ariana died. This moment, raw, violent, final, cut through Aberforth like a blade. The guilt was shared by all three participants, but the wound festered deepest in him. He had tried to protect his sister, and now she was gone. As the years passed, the chasm between him and Albus only widened. While the world saw Albus as wise and noble, Aberforth saw him as the man who had forgotten his family in the name of dreams. "My brother sacrificed many things, Mr. Potter, on his journey to power," Aberforth later told Harry. "He sacrificed Ariana. He might have done it without meaning to, but he did it just the same." The boggart, then, would capture this most haunting possibility, not Albus and Gellert as they were, but as they might have been had fate not intervened. Two powerful men once again side by side, their faces aglow with shared purpose, plotting to reshape the world. To Aberforth, this would not be just a spectral fear. It would be the embodiment of every unresolved anguish he carried. The sight would scream that nothing had changed, that Albus had never truly let go of the ideology that killed their sister. In that imagined moment, Grindelwald would be just as golden-haired and sharp-eyed as he had been in youth, his smile curling with dangerous promise. Albus would appear as he was in his prime, dignified, brilliant, with eyes full of purpose and blind hope. Aberforth would see not two men, but two delusions, the dream that destroyed them and the brother who embraced it over family. The boggart would be the past made flesh, a betrayal that refused to die. Even after Grindelwald's rise to infamy and Albus's subsequent battle with him, a duel that finally ended the Dark Wizard's reign, Aberforth's bitterness remained. He could not be soothed by Albus's later regrets or confessions. When Harry asked him about their relationship, Aberforth did not hesitate to speak plainly. "He was brilliant. He was selfish. He was my brother." The words ring with exhaustion, but also with enduring pain. The boggart would remind Aberforth of the truth he could never escape, that love and pain, trust and betrayal had always walked hand in hand in the Dumbledore household. The shape of a boggart is determined by the deepest fear of the soul. For Aberforth it would be less about personal safety and more about witnessing the resurgence of a broken past. In this twisted vision, Albus and Gellert might be raising their wands together, or poring over a parchment full of plans, or standing before a crowd with fire in their eyes. The details would not matter. What mattered was the alliance, the rekindling of a bond that had once promised glory and delivered ruin. Aberforth lived his life resisting this vision. He ran the Hog's Head, a dingy tavern far removed from the grand halls of power. He offered refuge to the downtrodden, the castaways. In his own way, he rejected everything Albus had once embraced, and yet he could never free himself from his brother's shadow. The wizarding world never stopped praising Albus Dumbledore. Aberforth, meanwhile, lived with ghosts. Ariana's death was a constant echo. He never married, never sought fame, never wrote books, or taught at Hogwarts. His life was one of quiet rebellion, a refusal to play by the rules that had brought him so much pain. And through it all, the image of Albus and Grindelwald, youthful and invincible, never left him. It hovered behind every headline about the Order of the Phoenix, every story of Albus's greatness, every whispered legend of the duel that ended an era. In the final year of the Second Wizarding War, Aberforth took a more active role. He allowed members of Dumbledore's army to use the secret passage from the Hog's Head to the Room of Requirement. He saved Harry, Ron, and Hermione from death at the hands of Death Eaters, but even then his help was reluctant, tinged with sarcasm and warning. "You're not a hero just because you're brave," he told Harry. "Plenty of brave men have done terrible things." The words seemed aimed not just at Harry, but at the memory of Albus. The boggart would not merely be a fear of history repeating itself. It would be the fear that it never ended. That deep down, Albus had always yearned for that fire again, had always mourned the loss of Gellert as much as he mourned Ariana. Aberforth saw this in his brother's eyes, in his silences. He recognized the guilt, but wondered if it had ever truly burned away the ambition. To the world, Albus Dumbledore died a martyr, killed by Severus Snape as part of a secret plan. To Aberforth, he died as a man still chased by the consequences of his youthful choices. The boggart would represent that unfinished story. What if the two greatest wizards of their age had reunited? What if their vision had lived? In one corner of the imagined scene, the spectre of Ariana might appear, not active, not menacing, but present, a pale, ghostly reminder of what was lost. Aberforth would see her not just as a memory, but as a silent judge. The boggart would make him face not only his fear of betrayal, but his powerlessness to stop it. This fear would not be abstract, it would be visceral. Aberforth might feel his knees buckle, his breath shorten. He would relive the moment of their duel, hear the shouts, smell the burning wood, see the flash that ended his sister's life. And then, rising from the smoke, the figures of Albus and Gellert, calm, composed, visionary. It is no accident that boggarts take personal forms. They strip away public images and reveal private truths. For Aberforth, the truth was not that he hated his brother, but that he loved him too deeply to forgive him. The boggart would force him to relive the pain of that love, how it had once bound them as brothers and then torn them apart. Even in death, Albus cast a long shadow. His name lived on in tales of sacrifice and triumph. But Aberforth knew the cost of that legend. He had paid it with tears, with silence, with years of exile in his own bitterness. The boggart would be his reckoning, his trial. Not a confrontation with a monster, but with a memory he could never bury. In that haunting vision, Grindelwald would turn to Albus with a knowing smile, and Albus would nod. No words would be needed. The image would say everything, that the past was not gone, only sleeping. That the ideals that shattered a family could always rise again. And Aberforth, standing there, wand shaking, would be forced to face the cruelest question of all. What if they had been right? The boggart would not answer, it would only show. And Aberforth, alone in the flickering light, would understand that some wounds never heal, they only change shape, like the shadows cast by those two terrible figures standing together once again. Number 25, Lucius Malfoy, loss of status and exile from society. Lucius Malfoy had always worn his wealth like a second skin. From the silver serpent head of his cane, to the immaculate polish of his boots, he moved through the wizarding world like a man born to rule it. To those who watched him sweep through the halls of the ministry or host guests beneath the cold chandeliers of Malfoy Manor, he was not merely a man, he was an institution. But beneath the marble pillars and proud ancestry, there was a fear that gnawed at Lucius like a hidden parasite. A fear more consuming than the threat of Azkaban, more suffocating than the looming shadow of Voldemort himself, the loss of status. Were a boggart to rise before Lucius Malfoy, it would not be a corpse or a dementor, nor even a vision of his wife or son harmed. No, it would be a reflection, a broken version of himself in tattered robes, stripped of his wand, cast out of the magical society he held dear. Behind him, the grand gates of Malfoy Manor would be bolted shut. The ministry, once a theatre where he played his part with elegance and duplicity, would now close its doors. That image, him, diminished and forgotten, would be his true nightmare. From his earliest days at Hogwarts, Lucius knew he was destined to be someone. Prefect, Slytherin's pride, the sort of boy whose name whispered through the corridors with admiration and caution. He surrounded himself with those of similar standing: Severus Snape, a half-blood he tolerated for his intellect; Avery and Mulciber, less intelligent but useful; and later the followers of Voldemort, with whom he aligned not out of belief but necessity. He built his world on alliances and perception, maneuvering like a chess master whose only concern was that the board remained intact. It was no surprise that he became a Death Eater. When the Dark Lord first rose, it seemed to Lucius that aligning with Voldemort was simply a clever investment in the future. He wore the mark as one might don a secret ring, hidden, powerful, and meant to signal superiority. But Lucius was never a true believer. Power was his god. Ideology was a game for lesser men. As long as his family's name was untouchable and their fortune secure, he was satisfied. Yet when Voldemort fell after the failed attack on Harry Potter, Lucius was swift to discard his allegiance like a snake shedding its skin. He swore before the Wizengamot that he had been placed under the imperious curse, that he had never acted of his own free will. It was a convincing performance, but the underlying motive was clear: preservation. As Dumbledore once noted, Lucius was a man who likes to feel in control. He did what he had to in order to retain his status. When we meet Lucius in the Chamber of Secrets, he is a man walking two paths. He is respected, head of the Board of Governors at Hogwarts, a donor to numerous wizarding institutions, a patriarch of ancient blood. But he is also arrogant and dangerous, slipping Tom Riddle's diary into the hands of a child to further a darker cause. This duality of public honor and private manipulation is the foundation of Lucius's character. He lives in fear of cracks appearing in the mask, but the Second Wizarding War would bring those cracks into the light. Voldemort's return marked a turning point for Lucius. Where once he had maneuvered from the shadows, now he was forced into servitude. He became not a master, but a pawn. The breaking point came during the debacle at the Department of Mysteries, where his attempt to retrieve the prophecy ended in disaster. For the first time, Lucius was exposed not as a cunning strategist, but as a failure. The punishment was swift and devastating. Imprisoned in Azkaban, Lucius tasted the bitter loss of control. Even when released, he returned not to power, but to a house occupied by his master. Malfoy Manor, once a symbol of his authority, became a prison where Death Eaters prowled the halls and his family cowered in silence. He looked like a man who had lost everything, as described in the Deathly Hallows when Harry, Ron, and Hermione were brought to the manor. Lucius had become a shadow of himself. Narcissa, his wife, remained composed, but even she could not hide the tremble in her voice. Their son, Draco, once haughty and proud, now stared at prisoners with a haunted expression. This was not the future Lucius had envisioned. The Malfoy name, once spoken with respect and envy, was now whispered with suspicion and contempt. The aristocrat had become a servant, and worse, a terrified one. The ultimate humiliation came when Voldemort used Lucius's wand during the Battle of the Seven Potters. "My lord, my wand!" Lucius asked, voice trembling. Voldemort took it without so much as a glance. In that moment, Lucius lost the final symbol of his power. The wand was not just a tool, it was his identity, his last vestige of dignity. When it snapped, it echoed like a death knell in Lucius's soul. Throughout the Deathly Hallows, Lucius is a man unraveling. He speaks less, he avoids confrontation. Even Bellatrix, his sister-in-law, now dominates the manor, laughing wildly while Lucius stares into the distance. He has been reduced to a bystander in his own life. No spell, no bloodline, no gold could restore the respect he had once enjoyed. That is why his boggart would be so terrifying. It would be a reflection not of what he feared might happen, but of what had already begun. The fall of Voldemort left Lucius in a peculiar limbo. He was neither imprisoned nor trusted. He had no allies, no influence, and most importantly, no voice. The ministry tolerated him because he cooperated, but forgiveness did not follow. When Kingsley Shacklebolt became Minister for Magic, Lucius's name was scrubbed from committees and boards. His donations were politely declined, invitations ceased. Even the Daily Prophet, once so eager for his patronage, no longer printed his letters to the editor. This social death was worse than Azkaban. The cold stone of a prison at least provided structure. But to be cast out, ignored by peers who once bowed their heads, that was the true punishment. Lucius lived in a gilded tomb, wandering the halls of a home that no longer mattered. The portraits of his ancestors watched in silence. Some may have turned their heads. He rarely left the manor now. The peacocks still roamed the garden, and the silver still shone in the dining hall. But it was all show. Draco, ever distant, avoided his father's gaze. Narcissa hosted small, somber teas but never spoke of the past. Occasionally, reporters attempted to speak to Lucius, hoping for scandal. He turned them away. He had become, to all eyes, irrelevant. One might expect that Lucius would search for redemption, but redemption requires humility, and Lucius Malfoy was never humble. He did not beg forgiveness from the public, nor admit his wrongs. He simply waited, for what he did not know. He read old books, he polished his cane. And every so often, when he passed the mirror in the hallway, he would catch a glimpse of himself. Older, paler, weaker. A ghost of a man who once commanded rooms. What he feared most was not that others had turned away, it was that he no longer believed in his own myth. Lucius had spent a lifetime building an identity of superiority, but identity is a fragile thing when constructed solely on lineage and public perception. The world changed, and Lucius had failed to change with it. In the cursed child, we see a glimpse of the man he became. He is softer, quieter, and less threatening. He worries for his son. The fire is gone. It is possible that he found some semblance of peace, but the echoes of fear remain. That boggart, himself, fallen and cast out, never truly disappeared. It merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for moments of silence and solitude to re-emerge. The tragedy of Lucius Malfoy is not that he was evil, but that he was hollow. He chose safety over bravery, appearances over truth. And in the end, he reaped what he sowed. His boggart was not an illusion, it was a prophecy fulfilled. He became the man he feared he might be, broken, silent, and forgotten. He once told the minister, "My family has always been a strong supporter of the ministry." It was a lie then, and everyone knew it, but now those words sound like a plea. Lucius Malfoy, the proud Slytherin, the cunning strategist, the polished aristocrat, was gone. In his place stood a man in shadowed robes, staring at locked gates, a snapped wand in hand. And though no Dementor hovered nearby, the air around him was cold. Number 23, James Potter, lifeless Lily and Harry, in Voldemort's hands. There is no scene in the Harry Potter books where James Potter faces a boggart. Yet, if we are to understand his character not just as a brave man, but as a husband and a father, then we must explore not what scared him in his youth, but what haunted him in his final years. For James, fear was never about himself. His greatest terror would have taken the form of Lily and little Harry, lifeless, held in the arms of Lord Voldemort. A vision that would not only embody death, but failure, not death as a concept, but the ultimate failure of a father and a husband, the failure to protect. James Potter was never a man who backed down from a challenge. At Hogwarts, he was mischievous and full of pride. Teachers like Professor McGonagall saw in him both exceptional talent and exceptional arrogance. He excelled in magic, particularly in transfiguration, and became an animagus before he was 17. He led the Marauders, formed unbreakable bonds with Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, and he stood as a symbol of youthful brilliance. But the day Harry was born, James Potter changed. Bravery turned into duty. Pride gave way to fierce protectiveness. In that child he saw not just legacy but purpose, and with that purpose came fear. It was not a fear he ever voiced. James was not the kind of man who confided his worries in long conversations, but those who knew him, Lily, Sirius, saw it in his eyes. A haunted look when the Order of the Phoenix heard rumours of Voldemort targeting the Potters. A sharp intake of breath when someone mentioned a prophecy. The nights he stayed awake long after Lily and Harry were asleep, wand in hand, walking through the house with silent footsteps. He feared not dying. He feared what might happen if he wasn't there when they needed him most. The boggart, a creature that transforms into what a person fears most, would not have needed time to decide its shape. It would become Voldemort, cloaked and cold, cradling Lily's broken body in one arm and Harry's in the other, the green flash of Avada Kedavra still pulsing in the air. It would not be violent in its movements. It would be still, quiet. Like a nightmare remembered, not an attack in progress. That stillness would break James Potter far more than any image of his own death ever could. James was not oblivious to the danger that surrounded him. After defying Voldemort 3 times, the Potters were forced into hiding under the Fidelius charm. Sirius Black had offered to be secret keeper, but, in a fateful twist, Peter Pettigrew took that role. James trusted Peter, and that trust became betrayal. But long before the final night, James suspected that time was running short. He moved like a man running out of time, desperate to keep Lily and Harry safe, even if he did not know the exact moment danger would come. One night, Lily found him standing in the doorway of Harry's room, just watching the boys sleep. Harry was 1 year old, with jet black hair that stuck out in every direction, and his mother's bright green eyes. He was everything good in James, everything human in a world turning monstrous. James never said what he saw when he looked at his son, but it was evident. He saw the future, and he feared its loss. Not the loss of power or pride, but of laughter, bedtime stories, of a life they had barely begun. We know from Lupin's experience in Prisoner of Azkaban that a boggart can destroy even the strongest man. When Lupin saw the full moon, it wasn't just a symbol of fear, it was a symbol of guilt, of the monster he feared he had become. For James, the boggart's shape would not merely represent fear, it would be the weight of his promise, the one he made when he held Harry for the first time and told Lily without words that he would keep them safe. Dumbledore once said, "You think the dead we loved ever truly leave us?" But James Potter feared the living he loved would be torn from him too soon. And they were. When Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow, James had no wand in his hand. It was in another room, but even unarmed he stood between the Dark Lord and his family. "Stand aside, you silly boy," Voldemort had said, but James didn't move, not out of recklessness, but out of conviction. He knew he couldn't win, but he could buy Lily and Harry 1 more second. That second cost him everything. His body fell in the hallway. His last thoughts were likely not of his own life, but of whether Lily had enough time to run. Whether Harry would be hidden well enough, whether he had done enough. This was the shape of his fear, not being killed, but being too late, too far, not fast enough, not strong enough. A boggart could not replicate Voldemort's power, but it could replay that moment. over and over. When Molly Weasley faced a boggart, it became the dead bodies of her family. "Ridiculous!" she cried through tears, and the bodies twisted and vanished. For James, the spell might have never worked, not because he lacked the magic, but because he could not imagine something funny about that scene. There was no laughter to be found in Harry's stillness, no humour in Lily's final breath. The image would paralyze him. Perhaps he would have to turn away, let someone else banish the creature, and that too would shame him. James was not perfect. He bullied Snape at school, often showed off, and sometimes let arrogance guide his decisions. But those flaws pale in comparison to his love. It was that love that transformed him. That love that led him to maturity long before he died. As Sirius once said, he died like a man. And a man, in James Potter's definition, was someone who protected what mattered most, even when the odds were impossible. The tragedy of James's fear lies in its inevitability. He feared exactly what came to pass. His nightmare was not a far-off fantasy. It was the very reality of his death. And yet, he walked into it with open eyes. The boggart would have shown him a scene he had played over in his mind countless times. Perhaps that's what made it so powerful. The fear wasn't foreign. It was familiar. It lived inside his chest every time he kissed Harry goodnight. Lily's sacrifice saved Harry. That is what the history books remember. But James's sacrifice was no less noble. He stood unarmed, not because he underestimated the threat, but because he prioritized love over defense. It is easy to call that bravery. But it was fear that guided his final act. Not fear of death, but fear of failure. He was afraid that if he moved aside, even for a moment, everything would be lost. That kind of fear is the most human of all. The Order of the Phoenix never spoke of James's boggart. But Lupin likely guessed it. Sirius too. Perhaps that's why they were so haunted after his death. They didn't just lose a friend, they lost the one who had always been unbreakable, the one who joked even in the darkest moments, the one who laughed at fear until fear became flesh. When the boggart took the shape of Lily and Harry's corpses, it would not speak, it would just exist, like a wound that never healed. Even after death, James lingered. In the Mirror of Erised, Harry saw his parents. In the Resurrection Stone, he heard his father's voice. "We are part of you," James told him, before Harry walked into his own death. And Harry did not tremble, because deep down he carried his father's courage, but perhaps he carried his fear too, the fear of losing those you love most, of being too late, of being unable to stop the darkness. James's boggart is not just an idea, it is a mirror. It shows us that even the boldest hearts are shaped by their most tender emotions. That courage is not the absence of fear, it is its companion. James loved fiercely, and so he feared fiercely. That is why the image of Lily and Harry in Voldemort's arms would have shattered him, because it was not about death, it was about loss, a loss he was willing to die to prevent. And he did. Number 26, Narcissa Malfoy, Draco's dead body. Of all the mothers who graced the pages of the Harry Potter saga, none embodies quiet defiance and sacrificial love more poignantly than Narcissa Malfoy. Her name rarely surfaces when speaking of heroes, yet within the shadows of war and loyalty she made a choice so brave, so utterly human, that it shifted the course of history. One might argue that her defining moment came not from power, ambition, or even fear, but from the primal terror that only a mother can know, the terror of losing her child. If Narcissa Malfoy ever faced a boggart, it would not assume the form of Voldemort, death, or disgrace. It would reveal the lifeless body of Draco, her only son, sprawled on the cold marble floors of Hogwarts, his silver eyes dulled forever. That vision, that unbearable silence, would be her deepest fear. In contrast to her husband Lucius, whose decisions were rooted in pride, legacy, and the pursuit of status within the pure-blood elite, Narcissa's motivations ran far deeper, intertwined with the desperate, invisible threads of maternal love. Lucius Malfoy feared losing power, Narcissa feared losing her son. This distinction matters more than many realize, for it shaped her every decision during the war. She was not an ideologue. She did not share Bellatrix's religious devotion to the Dark Lord, nor Lucius's willingness to serve Voldemort in exchange for influence. Her allegiance was never to Voldemort. It was always to Draco. When Dumbledore fell and the war escalated, Narcissa began to see the walls closing in around her family. The price of their loyalty had grown too high. With Draco ordered to kill Albus Dumbledore in a mission doomed to fail, Voldemort had sealed her son's fate as a pawn. "The Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform a task," she whispers to Snape, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with desperation. In that single moment, in that fateful visit to Spinner's End, Narcissa broke the ranks. She sought help, not from her master, but from Severus Snape, a man she barely trusted. She begged, she wept, she dropped to her knees and pleaded for her son's life. That act of defiance, sealed by the unbreakable vow, foreshadowed her most critical decision. Years of aristocratic training, of learning to maintain control, could not contain her anguish. Her mask of elegance and distance shattered the moment Draco was marked for death. She saw through the illusion of power Voldemort promised. What did influence matter if her son was destined for the grave? And yet Narcissa's true moment of courage came not in pleading, but in lying. It was the climax of the Battle of Hogwarts. Voldemort stood victorious, or so he believed. Harry Potter lay motionless in the Forbidden Forest, seemingly lifeless in the arms of Hagrid. The Death Eaters waited breathless. Voldemort demanded that Narcissa confirm Harry's death. A simple task, and yet within that heartbeat of silence, a lifetime of fear unfolded within her. She knelt, her long black hair falling like a curtain between them. Her hand trembled as she reached for Harry's chest, and then she asked a single question, barely a whisper, desperate and urgent. "Is Draco alive?" Harry nodded. With that answer, Narcissa Malfoy, the wife of a Death Eater, the niece of a fanatic, and the mother of a boy caught in the crossfire of prophecy, lied to the Dark Lord. "He is dead," she said aloud, condemning herself if discovered. But she did it without hesitation. She lied not to save Harry, not to end the war, but for the one thing she loved more than life. Her son. It was a deception, born from the same fear that haunted her, the fear of seeing Draco dead, alone in the ruins of the castle. She knew what Harry's survival meant for the war. She knew the consequences. Yet, in that moment, her loyalty to Voldemort crumbled completely. All that remained was a mother. Imagine her boggart, the corridor of Hogwarts, silent and blood-streaked. Light flickers from broken chandeliers. In the distance, the echo of spells. And there, at the end of the hall, Draco lies still, unmoving, a streak of crimson on his temple. His wand lies inches from his hand, fingers limp and cold. His robes are torn, and there is no life in his eyes. That is the terror that would drop Narcissa to her knees. Not the wrath of the Dark Lord, not shame, not exile, only the death of her child. This fear wasn't an abstract one. It was real, lingering, hovering over her in every moment Draco was at Hogwarts under Voldemort's orders. When Draco was forced to mend the vanishing cabinet, when he returned each holiday thinner and paler, with tremors in his hands and shadows under his eyes, Narcissa must have seen that boggart with her waking mind. Every time he left the house, every time his name echoed from the Daily Prophet, she must have wondered if that vision would become reality. "Draco is not a killer," Dumbledore had said. And Narcissa knew it, perhaps better than anyone. That knowledge didn't bring her pride, it brought her fear. And fear made her strong. The world often underestimates women like Narcissa Malfoy. Regal, composed, seemingly distant. Yet when pushed to the edge, capable of a love that defies even death. She lived among killers and fanatics, but she never became one. Her love never turned into vengeance. When the war ended, Narcissa did not seek retribution or justice. She didn't celebrate Voldemort's fall, nor did she mourn it. She simply took Draco's hand and walked away from the wreckage. In the final chapter of Deathly Hallows, when the Malfoys desert Voldemort's side and cross the battlefield to find Draco, it is not a political act. It is the culmination of everything Narcissa had feared and everything she had fought to prevent. In the films, this moment is visualized with stunning clarity. Narcissa wanders the forest in elegant black, pale and expressionless, her wand lowered, her heart beating only for Draco. She leans over Harry like a priestess administering last rites, and yet the power in that moment belongs entirely to her. With a single lie, she holds the fate of the wizarding world in her hands, and she uses it not for glory, not for manipulation, but for love. Her actions echo through the final chapters, even though they're rarely discussed. It was her lie that allowed Harry to return to Hogwarts unnoticed, that allowed him to kill Nagini, that gave him the time to face Voldemort and win. Had she spoken the truth, the battle would have ended then and there, and in Voldemort's favor. Her love, then, did not only save Draco, it saved everyone. It is easy to see Narcissa Malfoy as a cold woman. She rarely smiles, she rarely speaks, but that silence masks a storm. It is the silence of a woman who watches, who fears, who knows exactly what the world can take from her, and what she is willing to do to protect her son from it. Her portrait in a perfect world might show her as a villain's wife, but in the pages of history, she will be remembered as a mother who chose life over obedience. When we reflect on boggarts, the magical creatures that assume the shape of one's worst fear, we often focus on the dramatic or the terrifying, spiders, dark corridors, corpses rising from graves. But sometimes the most horrifying image is stillness, absence, the hollow quiet of a future that never was. For Narcissa, that stillness takes the form of Draco's body, cold and broken before its time. Even Bellatrix, her sister, would never understand such fear. Bellatrix feared nothing and loved only destruction. For her, Voldemort was salvation. For Narcissa, he was a means to an end, a dangerous alliance tolerated only to protect her family. And when that alliance threatened Draco's life, she abandoned it without regret. This divergence between sisters reveals more than blood ever could. Narcissa did not need madness to break her chains. She needed only love. Her story lacks fireworks. There is no duel, no sacrificial death, no monument built in her name. But that is what makes it so powerful. Narcissa's strength was quiet, unwavering, and deeply human. It is the kind of courage that doesn't sing. It whispers, a whisper that changed everything. J.K. Rowling never tells us what Narcissa sees when facing a boggart, but the evidence is there. It lies in her every decision, in every line etched on her face as the war unfolds. "My son," she says in essence, again and again. He is her world, and in that world there is no room for fanaticism, no room for blind loyalty, only room for Draco to live. When the war ends and Hogwarts begins to rebuild, Narcissa doesn't look back. She doesn't seek forgiveness or offer apologies. She simply walks beside her family, away from fire, away from ruin. For her, surviving the war was never about victory. It was about keeping Draco safe. So let us remember her not as the ice-hearted matron of Malfoy Manor, but as the woman who fooled a Dark Lord to save a child. The woman whose love outweighed fear. The woman whose boggart was not death, but the death of hope, of future, of the boy she had raised. That image, quiet and terrible, is not just her fear. It is her truth. Number 27, Fleur Delacour, Bill, telling her she ruined his life. Fleur Delacour was born under a rare constellation, it seemed. Beauty, elegance, and a fierce, diamond-like clarity of purpose. The daughter of a French wizard and a Vila mother, she entered the magical world not only cloaked in physical allure, but wielding a heart that burned with quiet loyalty. Many saw the shimmer, the accent, the grace. Few saw the steel. When she arrived at Hogwarts as the Beauxbatons champion for the Triwizard Tournament, the British students noticed her ethereal presence before they noticed her wandwork. Ron Weasley stammered. Harry Potter blushed. But beyond the surface, Fleur was a competitor. She faced dragons dove into the depths of the Black Lake and stepped through the mist of the final maze. Not for beauty, not for applause, but for honor. It was during these days that she met Bill Weasley. He was tall, confident, and carried the wildness of Egypt in his smile. Their romance bloomed not in a flurry of passion, but in shared values, freedom, courage, and devotion to family. Fleur moved to England to be with him, joining the bustling world of the Weasleys. Molly, his mother, eyed her with suspicion. Ginny mimicked her accent behind her back, yet Fleur stayed. Then came the night of the full moon. Bill Weasley was stationed at Hogwarts during the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, defending the school as Death Eaters stormed the grounds. In that chaos he was attacked, not fully turned, but scarred, by Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf who delighted in ruining lives. His face was torn, his body changed. The handsome, adventurous young man Fleur had fallen in love with now bore the deep wounds of war. When Molly Weasley suggested gently that perhaps Bill's engagement should be reconsidered, Fleur stood. Her eyes flashed not with Veela magic, but with raw human love. "I am beautiful enough for both of us," she declared, her voice quivering, not with anger, but certainty. "I do not need him to be handsome. I need him to be brave, and he is." That moment, sharp as lightning over the burrow, revealed Fleur's essence. Not a decoration, but a force. Not a guest in this family, but its fiercest ally. If Fleur Delacour were to face a boggart, the magical manifestation of one's deepest fear, it would not appear in the form of a Death Eater or a crumbling Beauxbatons castle. No, it would be Bill, not the Bill of werewolf scars or long hair braided with fangs. It would be Bill looking at her with pain in his eyes, his voice cracked with sorrow, whispering, "You destroyed my life." That is her terror. Not loss, but failure. Not rejection, but guilt. The boggart would not scream. It would not lash out. It would speak. Softly, devastatingly. In her mind, the worst possible fate is not that she will be left alone. It is that she will remain, and still not be enough to heal him. That she will stay, fight, love, and yet fall short. That her love, in all its fire and loyalty, will not save the one person it was meant for. There is a kind of fear that lives not in shadows but in light, the kind of fear that haunts those who dare to love deeply. Fleur, with her courage and elegance, knows what it means to stand in the aftermath, to bind wounds that magic cannot reach, to soothe nightmares that no potion can erase. She fears not the scars on his face, but the ones she cannot see. She fears waking to a man whose silence says more than words, whose eyes no longer meet hers, who holds her hand with polite distance. That is the ghost that lives in her chest. Yet this fear does not make her fragile. It makes her formidable. To live beside pain and not flinch, to look at the remnants of horror and say, "I still choose you." That is strength. When Bill recovered in the safety of Shell Cottage, hidden along the sea, it was Fleur who brewed his teas. Fleur who watched the tides with him in silence. Fleur who read the prophet with one eye while watching for his expression with the other. She never asked him to be whole again. She only asked him to let her stay. After their wedding, attacked, torn apart by the arrival of Death Eaters, Fleur still clung to him. In the days that followed, the world collapsed further. Harry arrived, broken. Griphook, the goblin, brought danger. Dobby died in her garden. Shell Cottage became a sanctuary for the wounded, a hospital for broken souls. And Fleur, in the eye of this storm, remained composed, even as her fears hovered like ghosts behind her. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Fleur is not the center of the action, but she is the soul of the shelter. She never demands the spotlight. Her actions are quieter, setting food on the table, offering warmth, wrapping the shivering with blankets not only of fabric, but of grace. Fleur's strength lies not in grand gestures, but in relentless, loving persistence. Many thought she would flee when Bill was changed, that her Velar blood would recoil from disfigurement. But those people never understood Fleur. What they mistook for vanity was pride, and what they missed entirely was devotion. "Bill is lucky to have her," Arthur Weasley eventually said. And he was right. Fleur knew she could never undo what Fenrir did. Magic has its limits, but what she could do was remain. That, in war, is the rarest spell of all. There is a passage in the books where Ron, long after Fleur has proved herself, finally sees her, who she is. Not the Beauxbatons girl with the silver hair, but the woman who loves his brother so deeply it becomes unshakable. Her beauty becomes irrelevant, or perhaps clearer, in the way a lighthouse is beautiful. Not because of its design, but because of its purpose. To imagine her boggart is to understand her soul. It is not the monster she fears, and it is the accusation that she, in all her striving and tenderness, could fail someone who trusted her. That is her nightmare, to love and yet harm, to protect and still cause pain. That is why her boggart would not yell, it would whisper, and that whisper would shatter her more than any scream. She is not afraid of being alone, she is afraid of being the reason someone else feels alone. It is easy to dismiss Fleur as a supporting character. The books do not dwell long on her chapters, but those who read carefully, who follow the silences as well as the sounds, understand her impact. Fleur is not a girl playing house. She is a woman who builds a fortress from broken stones. During the final battle at Hogwarts, when chaos reigns and death brushes every corner, Fleur does not flinch. She does not retreat. She stands beside Bill. The girl from Beauxbatons who once fought dragons now fights despair and wins. Years later, the scars remain. But Fleur does not ask them to fade. She accepts them. In fact, she reveres them. For they are not signs of weakness, but of survival. They are the maps of battles faced together. And in the quiet of the night, when the world is still, she sometimes traces them with her fingertips. Not to erase, but to remember. And if the boggart were ever to crawl from a dusty cupboard in Shell Cottage, taking the shape of her worst fear, she would not scream. She would not flee. She would raise her wand, steady, tears perhaps lining her eyes, and she would whisper the spell that saved Lupin in his youth, ridiculous. And she would turn that sorrowful Bill into something else. Perhaps a wedding day memory. Perhaps Bill in dragonhide boots trying to dance. Perhaps the first time he burned dinner and grinned at her with butter on his nose. Because that is what Fleur Delacour does. She faces the pain. She transforms it. Her love is not loud, but it is unyielding. Her fear is not selfish, but sacred. Her power is not in her bloodline, but in her choice. And perhaps that is the true magic of Fleur, that in a world of curses and wands, she reminds us that the most powerful spell is to love without condition, to stay when it's hardest, and to believe that loyalty can heal what even potions cannot. Fleur Delacour, the girl who once walked among dragons, found that her greatest challenge was not in the fire of beasts, but in the quiet ache of the heart. And she met that challenge not with glamours or charms, but with her bare, brave soul. Number 28, Severus Snape, Lily's corpse, and his own dark mark. Severus Snape, alone in the darkness of a forgotten Hogwarts corridor, stands face to face with a wardrobe that trembles and creaks as if harbouring some ancient grief. The room is silent, the air heavy. He knows what lies inside, though he's never admitted it aloud. He's not afraid of death or pain. His greatest fear is a memory made real, a guilt so sharp it slices through every defence he's ever built. The boggart bursts forth, and there she is, Lily Evans Potter, her red hair dimmed, her skin pale as moonlight, eyes closed as if only sleeping, but she is not asleep. She is dead. And beside her kneels Severus himself, not as the cold, composed professor the world knows, but as a broken man, hands trembling, sleeves rolled up, to reveal the dark mark glowing like fire carved into his flesh. It's not just a fear, it's a judgment, a sentence passed by his own soul. Snape's terror is layered, more complex than any student could imagine. He does not flinch at the idea of Voldemort's return or the cruelty of the Death Eaters. What destroys him is the weight of his own choices, the letter he carried, the prophecy he relayed, the single act that condemned Lily to die. In that moment, the boggart doesn't merely frighten him. It exposes the raw, unhealed wound of a lifetime. His mind does not wander to the night Dumbledore found him on the hilltop, weeping. It clings to the image the boggart conjured. Lily's lips are blue. Her hand lies inches from his. He could almost reach for it, but what right does he have? The mark on his arm pulses as if mocking him. "You chose this," it whispers. "You belong to the ones who killed her." This is not fear, it is remorse, frozen in time. And for Severus Snape, remorse is more than an emotion. It is a sentence he carries without parole. Unlike other fears, this one cannot be banished with laughter or light. The boggart's form is too close to his truth. Even a ridiculous spell might fail him. There is no humor in Lily's death, no absurd twist to the way she died or why. Snape's mask of sarcasm, his barbed tongue, his disdainful glares, these are his armor. But this image, this is his naked self, vulnerable, exposed, ruined. It reflects what Dumbledore once saw in him, a man who loved so deeply that even after her death he devoted himself to her memory, her son, and to a cause he once betrayed. "You have a habit of turning up where you're not wanted, Severus," Dumbledore had said once, but Snape never left. Not truly, not after that night in Godric's Hollow. He walks the halls of Hogwarts not as a teacher alone, but as a warden of his own guilt. Each classroom, each corridor, each glance at Harry's green eyes brings her back. The same eyes, her eyes, and in that Snape's punishment is eternal. He is forced to see the one he lost and what he helped destroy in the boy he protects but cannot love. The boggart's choice is precise because it captures Snape's duality. He is both executioner and mourner, both coward and hero. He gave Voldemort the prophecy that sealed Lily's fate, then turned against the Dark Lord to shield the son she left behind. That contradiction is unbearable, yet it defines him. His soul, as Dumbledore knew, was a curious one. There are no easy compartments in Severus Snape, no singular identity. He was a Death Eater, he was a spy, he was a teacher, and yet none of these labels explain the man who carried Lily's photo in silence, who brewed wolfsbane for Lupin without praise, who protected Draco in secret, and who met death with eyes wide open, saying nothing of the courage it took to die a double agent. The boggart reminds him that even in the act of atonement, he cannot undo the betrayal. When he watches Lily's lifeless form in the illusion, the pain is not new. It is relived. He is once again the young man standing in Dumbledore's office, pleading, "Hide them all then! Keep her, them, safe, please." That desperation never left him. It only changed shape. And when he sees himself next to her corpse, it's not just grief. It's the agony of being the cause. The mark is not merely a tattoo, it's a brand, a reminder that no matter what he's done since, he once knelt before evil. The world might never forgive that. He isn't sure he forgives it himself. We remember Sirius Black's fear, Dementors, symbols of hopelessness. We remember Molly Weasley's, her dead children, but Snape's fear is different. It isn't rooted in what could happen, but in what has already passed. The boggart shows him the moment he can never rewrite, the betrayal that broke him, horror that he cannot share. The quote from Dumbledore lingers over Snape's arc like a prophecy of its own. "You are a braver man by far than Igor Karkaroff. You know, I sometimes think we sought too soon." Dumbledore saw what the boggart confirms. Snape's greatest fear is not punishment, it is himself. Himself as he was. himself as he fears he still is. Snape, who scowled and snapped, who took points from Gryffindor with relish, who assigned Harry detention with cold calculation, he was not a man without feeling. He was a man who had learned to hide it so deeply that even his closest allies only saw glimpses. McGonagall respected him, Lupin distrusted him, Harry hated him, but all were wrong and all were right, because the man who taught potions in that cold dungeon, who loved the art of subtlety and the language of ingredients, was the same man who cast a Patronus in the shape of a doe. "Always," he said. One word and a lifetime unfolded behind it. The boggart knows what that word means. It knows the price of loyalty paid too late. If Harry had ever seen that boggart, would he have understood? Would he have realized what Snape sacrificed? Or would he have still called him a coward? The truth is, Snape didn't live for forgiveness. He lived for penance. He wanted no thanks, no redemption, just the chance to protect what Lily left behind. And yet even that was not enough to ease the vision the boggart offers. The guilt does not fade, it only sharpens. Every time he sees Harry, every time he steps into the forbidden forest or sits before a steaming cauldron, he carries that image with him, Lily, cold and still, himself, branded and broken. The final cruelty is this. Snape's greatest act of love was never known until after his death. Only then did Harry see the memories, feel the pain, learn the truth. Only then did he name his son Albus Severus, saying, "You were named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them was a Slytherin, and he was the bravest man I ever knew." But Snape never heard those words. The boggart did. It lingered in his mind, feeding off that knowledge, that he would die misunderstood, unloved by most, never held up as a hero in life. Only in silence, only in secret, did he matter. The dark mark glows brighter in the boggart's illusion. It pulses as if alive. Snape's own hand in that vision tries to hide it, but fails. It is a reminder not just of what he joined, but of what he lost. Lily's body remains still, her face peaceful, untouched by the chaos around her. That, perhaps, is the only mercy. And so if the boggart is a mirror of the soul, then Snape's soul is a battlefield between guilt and courage, between love and loss, between the boy who said mudblood and the man who died for her son. He is a paradox, a riddle without answer, a man whose story can only be told in fragments of memory and shadow. In the end, it is fitting that Snape's fear is not external. It is not a monster or a creature or a loss yet to come. It is the past made present. It is Lily's death, his own complicity, the mark he cannot erase. And perhaps that is what makes him most human, not his skill, not his secrecy, but his endless, unbearable capacity for remorse. Number 29, Gilderoy Lockhart, himself forgotten and ignored. Gilderoy. Lockhart, the peacock of the wizarding world, shimmered not with the light of his own achievements, but with the carefully stolen glories of others. His entire life was a stage play of deception, a glittering facade where the truth was buried beneath layers of forged tales and fraudulent fame. He craved adoration, not for who he was, but for the grand illusion he masterfully performed. And so, when we imagine the form his boggart would take, it is not a monster or a shadowy ghost, but something far crueler, himself, forgotten, unrecognizable, lost in the crowd of his own discarded lies. Lockhart feared oblivion more than death. To him, death could be romanticized, tragic and poetic, the end of a legend, but to be irrelevant, to be passed by without a glance, to become a man with no autograph seekers, no admiring whispers, no gasps of recognition. This was the stuff of nightmares. The boggart would manifest as a withered version of himself, perhaps grey-haired and stooped, standing in the bustling atrium of the Ministry of Magic. Wizards and witches would brush past him, oblivious to his presence, while he stammered out names of books no one remembered, begging for attention that never came. In his prime, Lockhart had mastered the art of charm. He signed books with a flamboyant swirl of the quill, posed with a practiced smile that could melt butter, and recounted tales of vanquishing banshees and obliterating werewolves with the cadence of a bard. Yet not one of these stories belonged to him. From the hair-raising adventures of Hairy Chinworth to the thrilling defeat of the Wagga Wagga werewolf, Lockhart stole them all, erased the memories of the true heroes, and repackaged their courage with his face on the cover. "I had to do something," he once said with a shrug. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry. Celebrity is as celebrity does." The irony of his downfall lies in the very spell he wielded so carelessly. Obliviate. The memory charm, his signature trick, was the blade he used to carve out his path to fame. But like all blades turned too often on others, it finally turned on him. In the Chamber of Secrets, as he attempted to erase the memories of Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, his wand, Ron's faulty wand in fact, backfired. The magic surged through him, erasing every self-serving narrative he had so carefully stitched into his mind. The result was a man stripped bare, no longer the handsome hero, but a fragile shell, uncertain even of his name. We see him again in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, a hauntingly ironic setting for a man who had feigned injury for profit. There he resided in the Janus Thickey ward, among long-term residents who lived in fragmented minds. His smile still surfaced, a vague ghost of old habits, as he signed autographs on blank parchment, unaware of who he was or why someone should care. "He still likes signing autographs," the healer said kindly, as if comforting a child. But the quill, scratched on without purpose, the signature meaningless, the man forgotten even by himself. Lockhart's greatest fear was never a dragon or a dark curse. It was being a nobody. The boggart would not scream or lunge. It would simply turn its back to the crowd and vanish. That was the terror, disappearance. In his glory days, he lived for the stage, for the gasps and applause. He fed on the spotlight like a starved beast. Yet the greatest cruelty was not exposure of his lies, but the silence that followed. No one cared enough to hate him. The world moved on. Even before his memory loss, Lockhart showed signs of desperation. He taught at Hogwarts not out of altruism, but because he needed a new platform. His books were already bestsellers, but the fame was waning. Students were unimpressed. His defense against the dark arts lessons were laughable. Hermione Granger, his most enthusiastic supporter at first, began to frown at his bumbling responses. Severus Snape's disdain was open and withering. "Fame clearly isn't everything," Dumbledore noted dryly, a line that pierced deeper than any curse. There is something deeply tragic about Lockhart, for his vanity masked a deep void. He built a persona so aggressively that even he began to believe it. His elaborate stories weren't merely lies, they became his truth. When he looked into the mirror, he saw the fabricated hero, not the coward who had run from every real fight. That level of delusion, cultivated so long and with such intensity, is a kind of self-imposed curse. The final irony is that the Obliviate spell didn't destroy who he was, it merely unveiled him. Gilderoy Lockhart had once believed he could rewrite reality. He tampered with memories like a sculptor with clay, molding people's lives to fit his narrative. But memory is magic of its own kind. It resists manipulation. In the end, even the mind has its revenge. The memory charm didn't simply erase, it hollowed. Lockhart became an empty frame where the portrait had faded. His greatest triumphs, the stories he peddled, were now less than whispers. And the real heroes, the witches and wizards he had silenced, carried on quietly, their names never known, but their truth intact. His room in St. Mungo's was covered in photographs, copies of old book covers, tattered posters from signings, yellowing clippings from the Daily Prophet. None of them sparked recognition. They were relics of a life he once claimed but never lived, yet he arranged them with care. Some small part of him, buried deep, still sought meaning in those images, still hoped that the world would remember, even if he could not. Perhaps that was the final cruelty. His body lingered, but the illusion had died.